In the beginning, there was chaos. Not the organized kind, not the carefully planned launch of a new professional sports franchise, but genuine, scrambling, last-minute chaos. The year was 1960, and professional football was about to change forever with the creation of a new league, the American Football League, the AFL, that would challenge the established National Football League's monopoly on the sport. 8 cities would receive franchises in this new league, 8 teams that would try to prove that professional football could thrive beyond the NFL's traditional boundaries. And on January 30th, 1960, at what felt like the very last possible moment, one of those franchises was awarded to a group of men representing Oakland, California. The group was led by Chet Soda and Wayne Valley, businessmen who believed Oakland deserved professional football, who saw potential in the East Bay city that sat across the water from San Francisco. Oakland was a working-class city, a port city, industrial and diverse, with a population that loved sports but had always lived in the shadow of San Francisco's more glamorous teams. The 49ers played across the bay, and while Oakland residents could root for them, there was something unsatisfying about that arrangement, something that felt like borrowing rather than owning, like being a guest rather than being home. Soda and Valley had lobbied hard for an AFL franchise, had made their case to the league's founders, had competed with other cities that also wanted teams. And at the last minute, literally at the final organizational meetings when franchises were being awarded, Oakland got its team. It was almost an afterthought, a late addition, granted without the careful planning and preparation that had gone into some of the other franchises. But it was theirs, and Oakland would finally have its own professional football team. Of course, having a franchise and having a team ready to play are two different things entirely. The Oakland group had a license to field a team, but they didn't have players, didn't have coaches, didn't have uniforms or equipment or an office or any of the 1,000 things a professional sports franchise needs. And most glaringly, most obviously, most problematically, they didn't have a name. A team needs a name, an identity, something fans can rally around. So the Oakland ownership decided to hold a contest, inviting the public to submit suggestions for what this new team should be called. It seemed like a democratic approach, a way to engage the community, to make the fans feel invested in this new franchise from the very beginning. Thousands of entries poured in, names of all kinds, some serious, some playful, some tied to Oakland's history and geography. The winning entry, announced with some fanfare, was Oakland Seniors. The Seniors. It was meant to honor California's Spanish heritage, to acknowledge the state's history and the diverse population of the Bay Area. And for a brief moment, Oakland had a team called the Seniors, preparing to take the field in this new American Football League. But the reaction was swift and brutal. Sports writers ridiculed the name. Fans hated it. The Seniors sounded awkward, sounded silly, didn't carry the kind of toughness or menace that a football team's name should evoke. In an era when teams were called the Bears and the Lions and the Giants, when names suggested power and ferocity, Seniors felt all wrong. The criticism was relentless, and the Oakland ownership, recognizing they had a public relations disaster on their hands, quickly reversed course. The Seniors would not be the Seniors after all. A new name was needed, urgently. And this time, the ownership didn't leave it to a public contest. They chose a name themselves, one that would prove to be far more fitting, far more enduring. They would be the Raiders. The Oakland Raiders. It was perfect, aggressive, rebellious, suggesting a team that would take what it wanted, that wouldn't ask permission, that would operate outside the boundaries of convention. Raiders were outlaws, pirates, fighters who played by their own rules. It captured something essential about this franchise's origins, this team that had been granted a spot at the last minute, that had been born in chaos and would carry that spirit forward. But even with a proper name, the Raiders still faced enormous practical challenges. Most significantly, they didn't have a stadium. Oakland had no facilities suitable for professional football. The city was working on plans for a stadium, but construction hadn't even begun, and the Raiders needed to play games immediately, in just a few months when the AFL season would start. So the Raiders became nomads, vagabonds, a team without a true home. They arranged to play some of their home games at Kazar Stadium in San Francisco, the same stadium where the 49ers had once played, nestled in Golden Gate Park. Other games would be at Candlestick Park, the 49ers' newer home on the edge of the bay. It was an awkward arrangement, playing home, games in another city's stadiums, never having that sense of territorial ownership that home field advantage requires. The Raiders were technically Oakland's team, but they were playing in San Francisco, borrowing facilities, existing in a kind of limbo. The coaching situation was equally uncertain. The Raiders hired Eddie Erdelatz as their first head coach. Erdelatz had been a college coach at Navy, had some success there, but professional football was different, required different skills, different approaches. And Erdelatz was inheriting not an established roster, but a collection of players assembled hastily through a draft of available talent. Men who hadn't played together, who were learning a new system, who were, like the franchise itself, figuring things out as they went along. That first season, 1960, was a roller coaster. The Raiders showed flashes of competitiveness, won some games they probably shouldn't have won, got fans excited about the possibilities. But they also collapsed late in the season, losing games they needed to win, revealing the fundamental instability that plagued the franchise. When the season ended, the Raiders' record stood at 6-8, 6 wins, 8 losses. It was below .500, a losing record in their very first season, but given the circumstances, the last-minute franchise award, the stadium problems, the hastily assembled roster, perhaps it was better than anyone had a right to expect. Eddie Erdelatz, however, would not get a second chance. After just one season, he was out, fired, or perhaps mutually parting ways with the franchise. It was a harsh reality, but also typical of this chaotic beginning. Nothing was stable, nothing was certain, everything was in flux. The Raiders existed, were playing professional football, had survived their first season. But they were already fighting instability, already searching for answers, already showing the turbulent character that would define them in the years to come. Those fans who showed up at Kazar or Candlestick to watch the Raiders play were witnessing something raw and unfinished, a team that was being built in real time, that was making it up as they went along. There was something appealing about that, something authentic. These weren't a polished, established franchise with decades of tradition. These were the Raiders, scrappy, uncertain, born in chaos, named by accident and then by desperate inspiration, playing home games in borrowed stadiums, fighting just to survive. And survive they did. That first season, chaotic and imperfect as it was, established that Oakland could support professional football, that the Raiders, despite all their problems, were real, were viable, were here to stay. The name that had replaced the ridiculous seniors would endure. The franchise that had been awarded at the last minute would go on to become one of the most iconic in all of professional sports. But in 1960, none of that was clear. In 1960, there was just chaos, uncertainty, and a team called the Raiders, fighting to establish themselves, fighting to survive, carrying forward a rebel spirit that had been born in that chaotic beginning and would never entirely fade. After that chaotic first season, after the brief tenure of Eddie Erdelatz in the borrowed stadiums and the 6-8 record that represented both survival and struggle, the Oakland Raiders entered their second year still searching for stability, searching for a home, searching for an identity that would define who they were and what they could become. The early 1960s were lean years, difficult years, years when the franchise's very survival sometimes seemed uncertain. The stadium situation remained a pressing problem. Playing home games in San Francisco had been awkward, unsatisfying, a temporary solution that couldn't continue indefinitely. Oakland needed its own facility, a place the Raiders could truly call home, where fans from the East Bay could come without crossing the bridge, where the team could establish territorial roots. But the grand stadium Oakland had been planning, the proper professional facility that would eventually become the Oakland Coliseum, was still years away from completion. Construction was slow, funding was complicated, and the Raiders needed somewhere to play now, not in some distant future. The solution, when it came in 1962, was both practical and deeply imperfect. The Raiders would play at Frank Yowell Field, a small facility that had been used for high school football and minor league baseball. Frank Yowell Field was tiny by professional standards. It seated just over 22,000 fans when the stands were full, less than half the capacity of the stadiums where NFL teams played. The facilities were basic, almost Spartan. There were no luxury boxes, no elaborate concessions, no grand entranceways. It was, frankly, barely adequate for professional football. But it was in Oakland. It was theirs. And for a franchise that had spent its first year as nomads, playing in another city's stadiums, having their own field, even a small, humble one, meant something. Frank Yowell Field became the Raiders' home from 1962 through 1965, for years of playing in what was essentially an oversized high school stadium, for years of fans sitting on metal bleachers exposed to the elements, for years of making do with less than ideal circumstances. There was something charming about Frank Yowell Field, something intimate. When the stands were full, and they often were, as Oakland fans embraced their team despite the modest facility, the noise echoed, the atmosphere felt close and personal. Visiting teams found it strange, this tiny venue where they were expected to play professional football. But for the Raiders, it was home, humble as it was, and they defended it fiercely. Yet the stadium situation was only one of the Raiders' many challenges in these early years. The team faced a more fundamental problem. They simply weren't very good. The roster was thin, lacking the kind of talent needed to compete effectively in the AFL. And there was a structural reason for this weakness, a reality built into the league's draft system that made it difficult for the Raiders to improve quickly. In professional football drafts, the worst teams pick first, giving them access to the best college talent. It's a system designed to create competitive balance, to help struggling teams rebuild. But the Raiders, because they had entered the AFL as that last-minute eighth franchise, had been given the last draft position in the league's initial player selection. They picked after everyone else, got the leftovers, the players other teams didn't want or hadn't noticed. And in the subsequent years, as the draft order was determined by the previous season's standings, the Raiders' late draft positions continued. They weren't quite bad enough to pick first, but they weren't good enough to win consistently either. This created a vicious cycle. Without access to top draft picks, the Raiders couldn't acquire the elite talent that transforms franchises. Without elite talent, they couldn't win enough games to build momentum and attract quality free agents. And without winning, they struggled to build credibility, struggled to convince players they were a franchise worth joining, struggled to escape the perception that they were a second-rate operation in a second-rate league playing in a third-rate stadium. The 1961 season was particularly difficult. The Raiders won just 2 games all year, 2 wins and 12 losses. It was worse than their debut season, a step backward rather than forward, a year of getting blown out, of watching other AFL teams sign better players and build competitive rosters while the Raiders languished. Fans still came to the games. Oakland loved having a team, loved the idea of professional football in the East Bay, but the losses mounted and patience wore thin. The 1962 season brought modest improvement but continued struggle. The Raiders were still losing more than they were winning, still searching for that breakthrough that would establish them as legitimate competitors rather than just participants. They moved into Frank Yowell Field that year, finally had their own home, but home field advantage only matters if you're good enough to capitalize on it, and the Raiders weren't there yet. Off the field, the franchise struggled for credibility in other ways. Financially, the Raiders were on shaky ground. The AFL itself was in a war with the NFL, competing for players, for television contracts, for the public's attention and money. The league was spending heavily to establish itself, and not all of its franchises were financially stable. The Raiders, playing in a tiny stadium with limited revenue potential, were particularly vulnerable. There were rumors, whispers, suggestions that Oakland might not be able to sustain the franchise, that the team might fold or relocate. The ownership group, led by Wayne Valley, was committed, believed in the franchise's potential, but belief alone doesn't pay bills or sign players. Money was tight, resources were limited, and every decision had to be made carefully, with an eye toward not just winning games, but surviving financially. It was a precarious existence, living season to season, never quite certain what the future would bring. And yet, despite all these struggles, the tiny stadium, the thin roster, the late draft positions, the financial uncertainty, the Raiders persisted. The fans kept coming to Frank Yowell Field, filling those 22,000 seats, creating an atmosphere that was intimate and passionate. Oakland had embraced this team, had claimed it as their own, and wasn't ready to let it go no matter how many games they lost. There was something about the Raiders that resonated with Oakland's working-class identity. This was a city that had always been overlooked, always been in San Francisco's shadow, always been told it was less important, less glamorous, less worthy of attention. The Raiders, struggling in their tiny stadium, fighting just to be competitive, embodied that same underdog spirit. They weren't asking for handouts or expecting success to be given to them. They were scrapping, fighting, trying to build something from nothing. These years from 1961 through 1962 were about survival more than success, about establishing a foundation more than winning championships. The Raiders were learning who they were, developing an identity that would eventually crystallize into something powerful and distinctive. They were learning to be rebels, to embrace being outsiders, to take pride in doing things differently than everyone else. Frank Yowell Field, that tiny stadium that would have been embarrassing to some franchises, became a badge of honor, proof that the Raiders didn't need luxury or grandeur, that they could compete anywhere, under any circumstances. The late draft positions and thin rosters became motivation, fuel for a chip-on-the-shoulder attitude that would later define the franchise. The financial struggles and questions about viability became determination to prove the doubters wrong. In these difficult early years, the Raiders were being forged, shaped by adversity into something harder, tougher, more resilient than they might have become if success had come easily. They were learning lessons that would serve them well in the years ahead. Lessons about persistence, about fighting when the odds are against you, about refusing to accept that you don't belong. The identity they were searching for was taking shape, slowly, painfully, in the small stadium and the losing seasons and the financial uncertainty. They were becoming the Raiders, not just in name, but in spirit. And though they didn't know it yet, though in 1962 it still seemed like survival was the best they could hope for, they were building towards something remarkable, toward a future when that rebel spirit would carry them to championships, when that refusal to accept limitations would make them legends. On January 19, 1963, a man walked into the Raiders' modest offices who would change everything, not just for the struggling Oakland franchise, but eventually for professional football itself. His name was Al Davis, and he was just 33 years old, younger than many of the players he would be coaching, and unknown outside of coaching circles, but possessed of an intensity, a vision, and a confidence that bordered on arrogance. The Raiders, coming off a dismal 1-13 season in 1962, their worst year yet, had nothing to lose by taking a chance on this brash young coach. They could hardly do worse than one win in an entire season. Al Davis had been an assistant coach in the AFL, had worked for the San Diego Chargers, had learned the intricacies of professional football from some of the best minds in the game. But more than his technical knowledge, more than his understanding of X's and O's, Davis possessed something else. An absolute, unshakable belief that winning wasn't just possible, but inevitable if you approached the game correctly, if you demanded excellence, if you refused to accept mediocrity or excuses. The Raiders named Davis both head coach and general manager, giving him complete control over football operations. It was an unusual amount of power for someone so young, so unproven as a head coach. But the franchise was desperate, was willing to try something different, was ready to hand the keys to someone who promised transformation rather than incremental improvement. Davis immediately set about changing everything. The culture, the attitude, the way players practiced, the way they prepared, the way they thought about themselves and their opponents. He was demanding, relentless, accepting nothing less than total commitment from every player, every assistant coach, every person associated with the team. Davis believed that talent alone wasn't enough. You needed the right mindset, the right approach, the willingness to do whatever it took to win. He coined a phrase that would become the Raiders' motto, the three words that would define the franchise for decades to come: commitment to excellence. It wasn't just a slogan, wasn't just marketing language printed on posters. It was a philosophy, a demand, a standard that Davis expected everyone to meet. Excellence wasn't optional, wasn't something you achieved occasionally when circumstances were favorable. Excellence was a commitment you made, a choice to approach every practice, every game, every moment with the determination to be the best. Davis also had a keen eye for talent, an ability to see potential in players others had overlooked or undervalued. He scoured the league for players who fit his vision, not just physically talented but mentally tough, players with chips on their shoulders, players who had been told they weren't good enough or weren't wanted elsewhere. Davis collected these cast-offs and misfits and molded them into a team that played with a unified purpose, a shared determination to prove everyone wrong. The transformation was immediate and stunning. The Raiders, who had won just one game in 1962, won 10 games in 1963, 10-4. It was one of the most dramatic single-season turnarounds in professional football history. The same franchise that had been the laughingstock of the AFL, that had seemed destined for failure or relocation, was suddenly a contender, competing for a championship, demanding respect from opponents who had previously viewed them as an easy victory. The players responded to Davis's approach, embraced his demanding standards, bought into his vision of what they could become. Games that would have been losses in previous years became victories because the team refused to quit, refused to accept defeat, played with a toughness and determination that reflected Davis's personality. Frank Yowell Field, that tiny stadium that had witnessed so many losses, now became a difficult place for visiting teams, a venue where the Raiders played with a ferocity that made up for their modest surroundings. Over the next few years, the Raiders continued to improve, continued to win, continued to establish themselves as one of the premier franchises in the AFL. Davis's influence extended beyond just coaching. He was building a roster through smart personnel decisions, identifying players who fit the Raiders' emerging identity, creating depth and competition that pushed everyone to perform at higher levels. In 1966, recognizing Davis's genius for football operations and his growing influence in the league, the AFL appointed him commissioner. At just 36 years old, Davis became the youngest person ever to lead a professional sports league. It was an extraordinary rise, from unknown assistant to head coach to general manager to league commissioner in just a few years. Davis took the position seriously, worked to strengthen the AFL in its ongoing battle with the NFL, advocated aggressively for his league's interests. But Davis's stint as commissioner was brief. The AFL and NFL were moving toward a merger. Negotiations were underway that would eventually unite the two leagues. And Davis, though he had served as commissioner with distinction, realized where his heart truly was. He didn't want to be a league executive, sitting in an office making administrative decisions. He wanted to build a championship team, wanted to compete, wanted to be in the arena rather than watching from the sidelines. So Davis returned to Oakland, but in a new role. He became managing general partner, effectively the owner or primary decision-maker for the franchise. Wayne Valley and the other original owners remained involved, but Davis was now in charge, had the authority to shape the franchise completely according to his vision. It was the perfect arrangement, Davis doing what he did best, building a winner, while the ownership group provided financial backing and stayed out of his way. That same year, 1966, brought another significant change. The Raiders finally moved out of tiny Frank Yowell Field and into their new home, the Oakland Alameda County Coliseum. The Coliseum was a proper stadium, modern and spacious, seating over 50,000 fans. It had real locker rooms, proper facilities, all the amenities that professional football teams expected. After years of making do with less, of playing in borrowed stadiums and then a cramped high school facility, the Raiders finally had a home worthy of their ambitions. The move to the Coliseum symbolized how far the franchise had come in just a few short years. From chaos and near failure to stability and success. From 1 win to 10 wins to consistent contention. From being an afterthought in the AFL to being one of its most respected franchises. And all of it traced back to that January day in 1963 when Al Davis had walked through the door, young and confident and determined to build something special. Davis had found the perfect match in Oakland and the Raiders. The city's working class, underdog mentality aligned with Davis's approach to building a team. The franchise's rebel origins, its history of being dismissed and underestimated, gave Davis material to work with, a narrative he could use to motivate players. And the Raiders' willingness to do things differently, to embrace an identity separate from the established norms, matched Davis's own iconoclastic personality. Under Davis's leadership, the Raiders were becoming more than just a competitive football team. They were becoming a brand, an identity, a way of playing the game that was distinctly theirs. The commitment to excellence meant never being satisfied, always pushing for more. The silver and black uniforms became symbols of toughness and rebellion. The Raiders were building a mystique, a reputation that would grow over the coming years into something legendary. As the 1966 season began in their new stadium, with Davis in control and the franchise finally stable and successful, the Raiders stood poised on the edge of greatness. They had survived the chaos of their founding, had endured the struggles of those early years, had been transformed by a young coach who refused to accept losing. Now they had everything they needed: the right leader, the right stadium, the right culture, the right identity. The pieces were in place. The foundation had been laid. And the Oakland Raiders, who had been born in chaos just 6 years earlier, who had been named Seniors by accident and Raiders by inspiration, who had played in borrowed stadiums and tiny fields, who had won just one game in a season before Al Davis arrived, were ready to become champions. By 1967, the Oakland Raiders had become exactly what Al Davis had envisioned when he took control just 4 years earlier. They were no longer the struggling expansion franchise playing in a tiny stadium, no longer the team other AFL clubs viewed as an easy victory. They were a powerhouse, feared and respected, playing in their new coliseum before passionate crowds, embodying that commitment to excellence that Davis had made the franchise's defining principle. And leading them on the field was a quarterback who perfectly fit the Raiders' aggressive, downfield attacking style of play. Darryl LaMonica had been acquired in a trade, another example of Al Davis's genius for identifying talent and making bold moves to acquire it. LaMonica had been a backup in Buffalo, waiting for his chance, much like the Raiders themselves had once waited for respect. But Davis saw something in him: a strong arm, the ability to throw deep, the kind of fearless mentality that matched the Raiders' emerging identity. LaMonica became known as the Mad Bomber for his willingness to throw the ball downfield, to take chances, to attack defenses vertically in ways that were still relatively uncommon in professional football. The 1967 season was extraordinary. LaMonica threw 30 touchdown passes, 30, a remarkable number for that era, when offenses were more conservative, when quarterbacks were taught to protect the ball above all else. But the Raiders didn't play conservatively. They attacked, threw deep, trusted their receivers to win battles downfield, trusted LaMonica's arm to get the ball there. Week after week, the Raiders won, often decisively, establishing themselves as the best team in the AFL. When the regular season ended, the Raiders' record stood at 13-1, 13 wins and just a single loss. It was dominance, a statement that the Raiders weren't just good but potentially great, that they had assembled something special in Oakland. The AFL Championship game beckoned, a chance to represent the league in the Super Bowl, to compete for a championship, to validate everything Al Davis had been building toward. The championship game was played on a cold December day, and it was epic, dramatic, the kind of game that people would remember for decades. The Raiders fought hard, played their hearts out, traded scores with their opponent in a battle that neither team could quite put away. The game went to overtime, sudden death, where the first team to score would win. But still, neither team could break through. The game went to double overtime, an almost unheard of length for a championship game, with exhausted players pushing themselves beyond normal limits. And then, heartbreakingly, the Raiders lost. After dominating all season, after that 13-1 record that suggested they were destined for glory, they fell just short in the most painful way imaginable. Double overtime, so close to victory, and yet ending in defeat. The locker room afterward was silent, stunned, filled with players who had given everything and still come up empty. The 1968 season brought more success, more winning, another year of the Raiders establishing themselves as an elite franchise. But it also brought one of the most infamous moments in television history, an incident that had nothing to do with the outcome of the game, but became part of football lore nonetheless. It was November 17, 1968, and the Raiders were playing the New York Jets in a nationally televised game. The game was running long, as football games sometimes do, approaching 7 p.m. Eastern Time. NBC had scheduled the children's movie Heidi to begin at 7 p.m., and as the clock approached that hour, television executives faced a decision: continue showing the football game, which was still in progress, or switch to the scheduled programming. They chose to switch. With the Jets leading late in the game and less than 2 minutes remaining, NBC cut away from the football game and began showing Heidi. Viewers in the East, who had been watching an exciting game, suddenly found themselves watching a children's movie instead. They were furious, calling the network in such numbers that NBC's phone system was overwhelmed. And here's what made it worse. After NBC switched to Heidi, the Raiders staged a dramatic comeback, scoring 2 touchdowns in the final minute to win the game. The television audience in the East missed it entirely, learned about the Raiders' victory only through news reports afterward. The controversy was immediate and massive, with angry fans demanding to know why they had been denied the chance to see the game's conclusion. NBC apologized. The AFL established new rules about not interrupting game broadcasts, and the incident became known simply as the Heidi game, forever associated with the Raiders, even though it was really about television programming decisions rather than football. The Raiders won that game, completed that remarkable comeback that most of the country didn't get to see. But when the playoffs came, when it mattered most, they fell short again. Another season of excellence, another year of dominance, and another failure to capture the championship that was the ultimate goal of everything Al Davis was building. The 1969 season brought more of the same pattern, regular season dominance followed by playoff disappointment. The Raiders were consistently excellent, were the team other AFL franchises measured themselves against, were respected and feared throughout the league. Darryl LaMonica continued to throw touchdown passes, continued to attack defenses downfield with that mad bomber mentality. The defense was physical and intimidating, embodying the toughness that Davis demanded. The Coliseum was filled with passionate fans wearing silver and black, creating an atmosphere that made Oakland one of the most difficult places in professional football for visiting teams. But championships eluded them. Year after year, season after season, the Raiders dominated during the regular season and then fell short when it mattered most. It was frustrating, maddening, a cruel pattern that tested everyone's patience and determination. How could a team this good, this well-coached, this talented not win the ultimate prize? What was missing? What kept them from taking that final step? Some suggested it was bad luck, the cruel randomness of sports where sometimes the best team doesn't win. Others wondered if there was something about the Raiders' aggressive style that worked in the regular season but became vulnerable in playoff games when opponents had extra time to prepare. Davis himself must have wondered, must have analyzed every decision, every play call, every personnel choice, searching for the answer that would finally deliver a championship. The players felt it too, that weight of expectations unfulfilled. They knew they were good enough to win. They proved it every Sunday during the regular season, week after week of dominant performances. But proving you can win and actually winning the championship are different things, and the Raiders kept coming up just short, kept experiencing that heartbreak of being so close and yet not quite reaching their goal. These years from 1967 through 1969 established the Raiders as a power, as one of the AFL's elite franchises, as a team built in Al Davis's image, aggressive, tough, excellent. Darryl LaMonica's 30-touchdown season, that 13-1 record, the consistent dominance, these were real achievements, proof that the commitment to excellence wasn't just words but a lived reality. The Heidi game, though just a television controversy, added to the Raiders' mystique, to the sense that this was a team around which dramatic moments seemed to swirl. But the championship still eluded them. 3 years of excellence, 3 years of being at or near the top of the AFL, and 3 years of falling short when it mattered most. The double overtime loss, the playoff disappointments, these were the bitter pills that came with high expectations, with being good enough that anything less than a championship felt like failure. Yet, even in this frustration, the foundation was being strengthened. The Raiders were learning what it took to win at the highest level, were developing the mental toughness required to push through disappointment and try again. Davis was refining his approach, learning from each playoff loss, adjusting his strategy, building a roster that would eventually break through. The culture of excellence was being reinforced. Losing in the playoffs hurt precisely because the standards were so high, because anything less than a championship was unacceptable. The AFL was about to merge with the NFL, creating a unified league with expanded playoffs and even greater competition. The Raiders, battle-tested by years of dominance and disappointment in the AFL, would soon face new challenges, new opponents, new opportunities to finally capture that elusive championship. They had proven they could dominate. Now they needed to prove they could finish, could win when it mattered most, could turn regular season excellence into playoff triumph. In 1969, the Raiders made another crucial decision that would shape the franchise's destiny. After years of playoff disappointments despite regular season dominance, Al Davis needed a head coach who could finally break through, who could take this talented roster and guide them to the championship that had been so frustratingly elusive. He chose John Madden, a young assistant coach who had been working with the Raiders linebackers, a big man with an infectious enthusiasm for the game and a mind that understood football at its deepest levels. Madden was just 33 years old when he became head coach, the same age Davis had been when he took over the franchise 6 years earlier. Like Davis, Madden was young for such responsibility and proven as a head coach, taking on a role that would define his entire life. But Davis saw something in Madden, a football intelligence, a way of connecting with players, an ability to manage the strong personalities that populated the Raiders roster while still maintaining discipline and focus. What Madden built over the next decade was remarkable, a sustained period of excellence that would finally deliver the championships Oakland had been chasing. From 1970 onward, the Raiders never missed the playoffs under Madden. Not once. Every single season, year after year, the Raiders were in the postseason, competing for championships, maintaining that commitment to excellence that Davis had established as the franchise's defining principle. It was consistency at the highest level, the kind of sustained success that only a handful of franchises in professional sports history have ever achieved. The 1970 season brought one of the most remarkable individual stories in NFL history, a tale of resilience and clutch performance that seemed almost too dramatic to be real. George Blanda was 43 years old that season. 43, an age when most football players have long since retired, when the body simply can't keep up with the demands of professional football anymore. Blanda had been a quarterback and a kicker for years, had seemingly reached the end of his career multiple times, but he kept playing, kept contributing, kept refusing to retire. That 1970 season, Blanda authored 5 miraculous comeback wins in a span of just 6 weeks. 5 times, with the game on the line, with the Raiders facing defeat, the 43-year-old veteran came through. Sometimes it was a field goal, sometimes a touchdown pass, sometimes both. Week after week, Blanda delivered late-game magic, turning losses into victories, keeping the Raiders' season alive when it should have died. It was remarkable, unprecedented, the kind of sustained clutch performance that seems impossible even in fiction. Watching Blanda work his magic, week after week, gave the Raiders and their fans a sense that something special was happening, that fate itself might be on their side. Here was a man who should have been retired, playing a young man's game at an age when most people are thinking about slowing down, and he was delivering in the most high-pressure situations imaginable. It was inspiration, proof that determination and skill could overcome physical limitations, that excellence knew no age limit. Beyond Blanda's heroics, the Raiders were building something more permanent, more sustainable. The defense became legendary during these years, particularly the secondary that became known as the Soul Patrol. It was a nickname that captured both the unit's effectiveness and its identity. These were predominantly black players in an era when professional football was still grappling with racial integration, and they played with a swagger, a confidence, a physical style that intimidated opposing receivers and quarterbacks. The Soul Patrol hit hard, covered well, created turnovers, embodied the Raiders' aggressive defensive philosophy. They weren't just good. They were brutal, playing right up to and sometimes over the edge of what was allowed, establishing a reputation for toughness that made quarterbacks think twice before throwing in their direction. The Raiders' defense became feared throughout the league, a unit that could dominate games, that could win championships through defensive excellence. On offense, a new star was emerging, a quarterback who would become synonymous with the Raiders' identity during this era. Ken Stabler, known as the Snake, took over as the starting quarterback and immediately showed he was perfect for the Raiders' style of play. Stabler was cool under pressure, unflappable in crucial moments, capable of delivering late-game magic that recalled George Blanda's heroics, but with the arm and mobility of a younger player. The Snake had an almost supernatural ability to find ways to win games that seemed lost. With the clock winding down, with the Raiders trailing, Stabler would drop back and make the throw that kept the drive alive, that moved the chains, that eventually found the end zone. It wasn't always pretty. Stabler played with a calculated recklessness, taking chances, squeezing balls into tight windows, trusting his receivers to make plays. But it worked time and time again, and the Raiders developed a reputation as a team that was never out of a game, that could come back from any deficit, that had a quarterback who specialized in late-game magic. Under Madden's leadership, the Raiders developed a personality that was distinctly theirs. They were tough, physical, willing to push the boundaries of acceptable play. They collected players with reputations, players who had been considered troublemakers or malcontents elsewhere, but who thrived in Oakland's culture. The Raiders didn't just accept misfits. They sought them out, believing that players with chips on their shoulders, players with something to prove, would play with extra intensity, extra determination. This approach created occasional controversies. The Raiders were penalized more than most teams, their physical style of play often crossing the line into illegality. They were accused of dirty play, of intentionally trying to hurt opponents, of caring more about intimidation than sportsmanship. But within the Raiders organization, this was seen as a feature, not a bug. They wanted opponents to be intimidated, wanted to be feared, wanted that edge that came from being willing to do whatever it took to win. Madden managed all of this with a surprisingly light touch for someone coaching such aggressive players. He wasn't a screamer like some coaches, wasn't constantly demeaning players or ruling through fear. Instead, Madden connected with his players as people, understood what motivated them individually, created an environment where discipline and freedom could coexist. He had rules, had standards, but he also trusted his players, gave them room to be themselves, accepted that the personality that made them difficult elsewhere might be exactly what made them effective in Oakland. From 1970 through 1975, the Raiders were consistently among the league's best teams. They won division titles, dominated regular seasons, entered the playoffs year after year as favorites or near favorites to win the championship. The Coliseum became one of the most intimidating venues in professional football, with passionate fans creating deafening noise, with the Raiders playing with a confidence and swagger that reflected their dominance. But there was still one problem, one frustration that lingered from the late 1960s and continued into these early Madden years. They still hadn't won the Super Bowl. Despite all the regular season success, despite never missing the playoffs, despite having Hall of Fame players and one of the best coaches in football, the ultimate prize remained elusive. The Raiders would reach the AFC Championship game, would get close to the Super Bowl, but something always went wrong. Some play or decision or bit of bad luck would end their season short of the goal. It was maddening, frustrating for everyone involved. The talent was there, Stabler at quarterback, the sole patrol on defense, a roster loaded with players who would eventually be inducted into the Hall of Fame. The coaching was there, Madden proving year after year that he was one of the best in the business. The culture was there, that commitment to excellence, that willingness to do whatever it took to win. But the championship, that ultimate validation, remained just out of reach. Still, these years from 1969 through 1975 were building towards something. The consistency, the sustained excellence, the development of an identity and culture that was uniquely Raiders. All of it was preparation for what would eventually come. Madden was learning how to manage the pressure of playoff games, how to make the crucial decisions that separate good teams from champions. The players were developing the mental toughness required to break through, to finally finish what they'd started so many times before. George Blanda's 5 miraculous comeback wins in 1970 had shown what was possible when you refused to quit, when you believed you could win no matter what the circumstances. Ken Stabler's late-game heroics were teaching the entire team that games weren't over until the final whistle, that the Raiders could find ways to win even when logic suggested they should lose. The Soul Patrol's physical dominance was establishing an identity that would endure for decades. The pieces were in place. The foundation was solid. And somewhere ahead, waiting in the near future, was the breakthrough that would finally, after so many years of coming close, deliver the championship that Al Davis had been building towards since that January day in 1963 when he first walked through the Raiders' doors. After years of coming close, after seasons of dominance that ended in playoff disappointment, after building one of the most talented rosters in professional football only to fall short of the ultimate goal time and time again, the 1976 Oakland Raiders finally, definitively, magnificently broke through. This was the season when everything that Al Davis had been building since 1963, when everything John Madden had been refining since 1969, when all the talent and toughness and commitment to excellence finally coalesced into something perfect, unstoppable, championship caliber. The season began, and the Raiders won. Then they won again. And again. Week after week, opponent after opponent, the Raiders simply could not be beaten. They weren't just winning. They were dominating, dismantling teams with a combination of offensive efficiency and defensive ferocity that made them look like they were playing a different game than everyone else. The Soul Patrol secondary was shutting down passing attacks. Ken Stabler was executing the offense with precision and flair. The offensive line was opening massive holes for the running game. Every unit, every player, every aspect of the team was clicking perfectly. The winning streak reached extraordinary lengths. 12 consecutive victories to close out the regular season. 12 straight games where the Raiders took the field and imposed their will, where opponents tried everything they could think of and still went home defeated. By the time the regular season ended, the Raiders' record stood at 13-1, their only loss coming early in the season before the team had fully found its rhythm. 13 wins and just one loss. It was dominance, the kind of record that suggested a team destined for greatness, a team that had finally figured out how to translate regular season excellence into championship caliber play. But regular season success had never been the Raiders' problem. They had dominated regular seasons before, had won 13 games in 1967, had been favored to win championships multiple times. The question was whether this team, this roster, this season would be different. Could they maintain their excellence through the playoffs? Could they avoid the mistakes and bad luck that had ended previous championship runs? Could they finally, after all these years, finish the job? The playoffs began, and the Raiders kept winning. They defeated their opponents convincingly, never allowing doubt to creep in, never giving other teams hope that maybe the Raiders could be beaten. Each victory was another step closer to the Super Bowl, another opponent vanquished, another reason to believe that this time, would be different. And then they were there. Super Bowl 11, played in Pasadena at the Rose Bowl on January 9, 1977. The Oakland Raiders versus the Minnesota Vikings, a team making their fourth Super Bowl appearance. The Vikings had lost their previous 3 Super Bowls, carried their own burden of championship disappointment. But on this day, they would face a Raiders team that was operating at the peak of its powers, a team that had waited too long for this moment to let it slip away. From the opening kickoff, the Raiders were in control. They weren't nervous, weren't tentative, weren't treating this like some precious opportunity that might never come again. They played Raiders football, aggressive, physical, confident. The Soul Patrol forced turnovers, created short fields for the offense. Ken Stabler, the Snake, dropped back and delivered passes with the same coolness he'd shown in all those late-game comebacks, but this time with a lead to protect rather than a deficit to overcome. The offensive line dominated Minnesota's defensive front, opening holes for the running game that allowed the Raiders to control the clock, to keep their defense fresh, to methodically grind down the Vikings' will to compete. When the Raiders did throw, Stabler's passes found their targets, moving the chains, scoring touchdowns, building a lead that Minnesota could never seriously threaten. The final score was 32-14. 32-14. It wasn't close, wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind of nail-biting finish that makes for legendary stories. But it was perfect in its own way. A complete, dominant performance that left no doubt about who the better team was, who deserved to be champions. The Raiders had crushed the Vikings, had won convincingly, had proven that they weren't just good enough to reach the Super Bowl, but good enough to win it decisively. Ken Stabler was named Super Bowl MVP, recognition for the quarterback who had led the offense with such efficiency and skill. But really, the MVP could have gone to any number of Raiders that day. The entire team had played championship football, had executed the game plan perfectly, had done what champions do, dominated when it mattered most. As the final seconds ticked off the clock, as the Raiders' sideline erupted in celebration, as Al Davis and John Madden embraced, 13 years of building had finally reached its culmination. The franchise that had been awarded at the last minute in 1960, that had been briefly named the Seniors, that had played in borrowed stadiums and tiny fields, that had struggled through losing seasons before Al Davis arrived to transform them. that franchise was now world champion. Looking at the roster, it was easy to see why. The 1976 Raiders had 8 players who would eventually be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. 8. It was an extraordinary concentration of talent, a collection of all-time greats playing together in their primes. Ken Stabler at quarterback, of course. Fred Biletnikoff at wide receiver, catching passes with those sticky fingers, running precise routes. Gene Upshaw and Art Shell on the offensive line, both dominating their positions, both destined for Canton. Willie Brown in the secondary, one of the Soul Patrol's anchors. Ted Hendricks at linebacker, the Mad Stork, long and rangy, and everywhere the ball went. Dave Casper at tight end. And more. Players whose names would be enshrined alongside the greatest ever to play the game. This wasn't just a good team that got hot at the right time. This was an all-time great team, one of the best rosters ever assembled in professional football. And in 1976, with everything clicking, with no injuries derailing them, with 13 years of organizational excellence finally culminating in the ultimate prize, they had proven they were the best team in the world. For Al Davis, this was vindication. Everything he had preached about commitment to excellence, everything he had built since taking over a 1-13 team in 1963, had led to this moment. The aggressive philosophy, the willingness to take chances on players with bad reputations, the emphasis on speed and physicality, the creation of a unique Raiders culture, it had all worked. The trophy in his hands was proof that his way was right, that the Raiders' approach to building a team and playing the game could lead to championships. For John Madden, this was relief mixed with joy. The pressure of coaching such talented teams without winning a championship had been enormous. Every playoff loss had brought questions about whether he could win the big game, whether he had what it took to be a championship coach. Now those questions were answered definitively. Madden was a champion, had guided his team through a perfect playoff run, had made the right decisions at the right times, had managed all those strong personalities and egos and molded them into a cohesive unit that played its best when it mattered most. For the players, this was everything they had worked for. The veterans who had experienced those playoff disappointments in previous years could finally exhale, could finally say they were champions, could finally know that all the dedication and sacrifice had been worth it. The younger players were experiencing their first championship, creating memories that would last a lifetime, understanding now what it felt like to be the best, to reach the pinnacle of their profession. For the city of Oakland, for those fans who had supported the team through the early struggles and the playoff disappointments, who had filled the Coliseum year after year even when championships remained elusive, this was their moment too. The Raiders were world champions, and Oakland could celebrate, could take pride in what their team had accomplished, could revel in being on top of the football world. The 1976 season, that 13-1 regular season followed by dominant playoff victories culminating in the Super Bowl triumph, would stand as one of the greatest seasons in NFL history. The Raiders had ruled the league that year, had been the best team from start to finish, had left no doubt about their superiority. And after 13 years of building, after seasons of coming close and falling short, after all the frustration and disappointment, they were finally, officially, definitively champions. After winning the Super Bowl in 1976, the Oakland Raiders didn't soften, didn't become more conventional, didn't try to polish their image or make themselves more palatable to critics who had always viewed their physical style with suspicion. If anything, they leaned into their identity even more, embraced their role as the league's outlaws, the team everyone loved to hate, the franchise that played on the edge of, and sometimes over, the boundaries of acceptable play. They were champions now, but they were still the Raiders, and being the Raiders meant something specific, something that couldn't be compromised or diluted for the sake of popularity. The late 1970s cemented the Raiders' reputation as the NFL's villains, the team whose physical style of play polarized the entire league. Fans and analysts split into two camps. Those who admired the Raiders' toughness, their refusal to back down, their commitment to intimidating opponents, and those who viewed them as dirty, as a team that crossed lines, as players who cared more about hurting opponents than about playing the game with honor and sportsmanship. The Raiders collected players who fit this mold, who had reputations for physical play that bordered on violence. They wore their silver and black uniforms like armor, took pride in being feared, cultivated an image of ruthlessness that was part calculated strategy and part genuine expression of their football philosophy. Al Davis believed in speed and violence. Those were his words, the principles he emphasized. Speed to get to the ball carrier, violence in the collision that followed. It was football stripped to its essential nature, the controlled combat that had always been at the sport's core, but which most teams tried to package more palatably. The defensive secondary, still anchored by members of the Soul Patrol, played with a physicality that made receivers think twice before coming across the middle. Jack Tatum was perhaps the most notorious of these defenders, a safety who hit with devastating force, who seemed to approach each tackle as an opportunity to deliver a message, to remind ball carriers that catching passes over the middle against the Raiders came with consequences. Tatum called himself the assassin, embraced the reputation for brutal hits, played the game with an intensity that could be both admired and feared. He was within the rules, mostly, but he played right up to the edge, delivered hits that were legal but devastating, hits that stayed with receivers long after the game ended, that made them hear footsteps on subsequent plays, that created the fear that was part of the Raiders' defensive strategy. And then came August 12, 1978, a preseason game against the New England Patriots that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Darryl Stingley, a Patriots receiver, ran a crossing route over the middle. Jack Tatum came to make the tackle, delivered a hit that was, by the standards of the time, legal, or at least not flagrantly illegal. But the collision was catastrophic. Stingley went down and didn't get up. The injury was severe, devastating. Stingley was paralyzed from the neck down. His career ended in an instant, his life fundamentally and permanently altered. The incident became infamous, a tragedy that sparked debates about the nature of football, about where the line between aggressive play and dangerous play should be drawn, about whether the Raiders' physical style had finally gone too far. Tatum maintained that he had been playing football the way he'd always played it, the way he'd been taught, the way the game demanded. He expressed regret that Stingley was injured but never apologized for the hit itself, believing he had done nothing wrong according to the rules and standards of the game. The collision haunted discussions about the Raiders for years afterward. Critics pointed to it as evidence that the team's approach to the game was reckless, dangerous, prioritizing intimidation over safety. Supporters argued that football was a violent sport, that injuries were tragic but inevitable, that Tatum had been playing within the rules and couldn't be blamed for an outcome no one intended. The debate never reached resolution, never achieved consensus. But the incident became inseparable from the Raiders' identity, part of the mystique and controversy that surrounded them. The Raiders' outlaw image was reinforced by other incidents, other moments that became legendary for their audacity and their bending, or breaking, of football's unwritten rules. One of the most famous came on September 10, 1978, in a game against the San Diego Chargers that would forever be known for its bizarre, controversial ending. The Raiders were trailing late in the game, facing fourth down at the Chargers' 14-yard line with time running out. Ken Stabler dropped back to pass, was about to be sacked, and in desperation, fumbled the ball forward. Whether intentionally or not was debated then and is still debated now. The ball rolled forward, tumbling toward the end zone. Raiders running back Pete Banaszak tried to recover it, couldn't, and batted it forward. Then Raiders tight end Dave Casper also batted it forward before finally falling on it in the end zone for a touchdown. It was chaos, confusion, a play that looked more like a rugby scrum than American football. The officials, after conferring, ruled it a touchdown. The Raiders had won on what became known as the Holy Roller play, a scrambling, improvised, possibly illegal sequence that had somehow resulted in a score. The Chargers were furious, argued that the forward batting of the ball should have been illegal, that the play should never have counted. But the touchdown stood, and the Raiders had stolen another improbable victory. The NFL, recognizing that the play exposed a loophole in the rules, changed them in the offseason. Now, on fourth down or in the final 2 minutes of a half, only the player who fumbles can advance the fumble. It became known as the Dave Casper rule or the Holy Roller rule, forever linking the Raiders to a play that seemed to perfectly capture their willingness to find any way to win, conventional or otherwise. These incidents, the Stingley tragedy, the Holy Roller, countless other penalties and controversies, contributed to a mystique that surrounded the Raiders. They were the bad guys, the team draped in black, the franchise that seemed to delight in being hated by everyone except their own passionate fan base. They were accused of dirty play, of intentionally trying to injure opponents, of caring more about intimidation than sportsmanship. But within the Raiders organization, this was seen not as a problem, but as an identity to be embraced. Win or lose, they would be the Raiders, would play their style of football, would refuse to apologize for their physicality or their willingness to push boundaries. Al Davis encouraged this attitude, believed that being feared was an advantage, that opponents who were worried about getting hurt were already halfway to being beaten. The fans embraced it too. The Coliseum became known as the Black Hole, a section of the stadium where Raiders fans dressed in elaborate costumes, skulls and spikes and chains, pirates and medieval warriors, anything that emphasized the team's outlaw identity. These fans were as intimidating as the team itself, creating an atmosphere that visiting teams and their supporters found hostile and unsettling. It was theater, spectacle, but it was also genuine passion, a fan base that loved their team precisely because of, not despite, their villain status. The late 1970s, then, were when the Raiders' identity was fully formed, when they became not just a championship team, but a legend, a brand, a cultural phenomenon that transcended football. They were the team kids pretended to be on playgrounds, the franchise whose merchandise sold even in cities where they weren't beloved but rather feared and respected. The silver and black became iconic, recognizable anywhere, associated with toughness and rebellion and a refusal to conform. Win or lose, and they did both during these years, remaining competitive but not capturing another Super Bowl. The Raiders were the NFL's most compelling story, the team everyone had an opinion about, the franchise that generated more discussion and debate than any other. They were villains, absolutely, embraced that role fully. But they were also legends, players whose names would be remembered long after their careers ended, a team whose identity was so strong, so distinctive, that it would endure across generations. The violence, the controversies, the outlaw mystique, all of it was part of what made the Raiders the Raiders. They weren't trying to be popular, weren't concerned with being likable. They were committed to excellence, to winning, to playing football their way regardless of what anyone else thought. And in the late 1970s, with a championship recently won and their identity fully formed, the Oakland Raiders stood as one of the most feared, most respected, most polarizing franchises in all of professional sports. By 1980, the Raiders were in a strange position. They were still good, still competitive, still filled with talented players, and coached by John Madden's successor, Tom Flores, who had taken over when Madden retired after the 1978 season. But they weren't dominant the way they had been in 1976. They had struggled through the regular season, winning some games, losing others, showing flashes of their former excellence, but also revealing vulnerabilities that kept them from running away with their division. When the regular season ended, the Raiders found themselves in an unfamiliar position. They were a wild card team, having to enter the playoffs through the back door rather than as division champions. Being a wild card meant no home field advantage, meant traveling to face opponents in hostile environments, meant being the underdog rather than the favorite. For a franchise built on dominance and intimidation, it was an uncomfortable position. But it was also, in a strange way, fitting for the Raiders. They had always been rebels, had always embraced being outsiders, had always played better when they had something to prove and chips on their shoulders. Maybe being a wild card, being dismissed by analysts who didn't think they could win on the road against better-seeded teams, was exactly the situation that would bring out the best in them. The quarterback situation added another layer of uncertainty to the season. Dan Pastorini had been acquired to replace Ken Stabler, who had been traded away in a controversial move that shocked Raiders fans. Pastorini was talented, but had struggled with injuries and inconsistency. And then, partway through the 1980 season, Pastorini himself was injured, forcing the Raiders to turn to their backup quarterback, a journeyman named Jim Plunkett, who seemed to be at the end of his career rather than approaching any kind of glory. Jim Plunkett's story was one of rise and fall and, potentially, resurrection. He had been the first overall pick in the 1971 draft, had won the Heisman Trophy at Stanford, had been expected to be a franchise quarterback for years to come. But things hadn't worked out. He had struggled in New England, been traded to San Francisco, struggled there too, and eventually found himself as a backup in Oakland, a former #1 pick now reduced to holding a clipboard, his career seemingly over except for providing occasional relief when the starter was injured. But when Plunkett took over for the injured Pastorini in 1980, something changed. Maybe it was the familiarity of playing in the Bay Area, close to where he'd starred at Stanford. Maybe it was the Raiders' culture, which embraced players with something to prove, which saw potential in cast-offs that other teams had given up on. Maybe it was just timing, everything aligning at exactly the right moment. Whatever the reason, Jim Plunkett, written off by most of the football world, began playing the best football of his life. Plunkett wasn't flashy, wasn't going to make spectacular plays that ended up on highlight reels. But he was efficient, smart, capable of executing the Raiders' offense without making crucial mistakes. He managed games, made the throws that needed to be made, kept the offense moving. And most importantly, he won. Under Plunkett's leadership, the Raiders finished the season well enough to claim that wild card spot, to get into the playoffs with a chance to compete for a championship despite all the doubts and questions surrounding them. The defense, meanwhile, was having a remarkable season anchored by one of the most dominant individual performances in NFL history. Lester Hayes, a cornerback who embodied everything the Raiders' defense represented: physical, intimidating, absolutely unafraid to challenge receivers, was having the kind of year that defensive backs dream about. Hayes intercepted 13 passes during the 1980 season. 13. It was an extraordinary number, the result of perfect timing, exceptional ball skills, and the kind of aggressive coverage that forced quarterbacks into mistakes. Hayes was known for using stickum, a legal at the time adhesive substance that receivers and defensive backs could apply to their hands to help them catch the ball. Hayes used it liberally, coating his hands and forearms, making himself even more effective at pulling in those interceptions. The NFL would eventually ban stickum, but in 1980 it was legal, and Hayes took full advantage, creating turnovers, shutting down opposing passing attacks, giving the Raiders offense short fields and extra possessions. With Lester Hayes dominating in the secondary and the rest of the defense playing with that familiar Raiders physicality, the wildcard Raiders entered the playoffs as a dangerous team despite their seeding. They had a defense that could win games, a quarterback who was playing beyond expectations, and that rebel mentality that made them believe they could beat anyone regardless of where the game was played. The playoff run that followed was shocking, improbable, the kind of underdog story that seems scripted for Hollywood. The Raiders won on the road, then won again, advancing through the playoffs by beating teams that had better records, home field advantage, and supposedly superior rosters. Plunkett kept making the throws that mattered. Hayes kept creating turnovers. The defense kept hitting, kept intimidating, kept playing Raiders football. And then, remarkably, impossibly, the Raiders found themselves in Super Bowl 15, facing the Philadelphia Eagles in New Orleans. They had done what no wild-card team had ever done before, fought their way through the playoffs from that disadvantaged position all the way to the championship game. The Eagles were favored, were the NFC champions, had their own talented roster and passionate fan base. But the Raiders had momentum, had confidence born from their playoff victories, had a team full of players who thrived on proving doubters wrong. The Super Bowl itself was decisive, dominant, a performance that left no doubt about which team deserved to win. Jim Plunkett threw 3 touchdown passes, played with the efficiency and poise that had characterized his entire playoff run. The defense, led by Lester Hayes and the rest of the secondary, contained the Eagles' offense, created pressure, forced mistakes. The Raiders won 27-10, capturing their second Super Bowl championship in 5 years, proving that even as a wild card, even as underdogs, they were still the Raiders, still capable of winning when it mattered most. Jim Plunkett was named Super Bowl MVP, a remarkable achievement for a player who had been written off, who had seemed destined to finish his career as a forgotten backup. His story became one of the great redemption tales in NFL history, from #1 pick to disappointment, to backup, to Super Bowl champion and MVP. It was proof that careers aren't linear, that second chances matter, that the right situation can unlock potential that seemed lost forever. The Raiders became the first wild-card team ever to win the Super Bowl, a distinction that added another chapter to their outlaw legend. They hadn't won the conventional way, hadn't dominated the regular season and rolled through the playoffs as favorites. They had done it the hard way, as underdogs, on the road, with a backup quarterback and a defense that wouldn't quit. It was perfectly Raiders. Unconventional, rebellious, succeeding when everyone expected them to fail. For Al Davis, this was vindication of his philosophy once again. The Raiders' way, collecting cast-offs, embracing players with something to prove, building a culture where misfits could thrive, had produced another championship. Jim Plunkett was exactly the kind of player Davis loved to acquire. Talented but discarded by other teams, carrying a chip on his shoulder, needing only the right situation to excel. And the Raiders had provided that situation, had believed in Plunkett when no one else did, and had been rewarded with a Super Bowl. For Tom Flores, coaching in only his second season, this was an extraordinary achievement. Stepping into John Madden's shoes had been daunting. Madden was beloved, had won a championship, had established a culture that seemed impossible to replicate. But Flores had done more than replicate it. He had added to it, had guided a wild-card team through the playoffs to a championship, had proven he was a championship-caliber coach in his own right. For the players, for Lester Hayes with his 13 interceptions and dominant postseason, for Jim Plunkett resurrecting his career, for all the Raiders who had fought through that wild-card playoff run, this was the ultimate reward. They had proven that the Raiders' mystique wasn't just about the past, wasn't just about the 1976 championship team. This generation of Raiders had created their own legacy, had won their own championship, had done it in a way that somehow seemed even more Raiders than winning as favorites. They had won as rebels, as underdogs, as the wild cards who refused to accept their disadvantaged position as destiny. The 1980 season, that wild card run that ended in Super Bowl glory, stands as one of the most remarkable stories in NFL playoff history. The Raiders had done the impossible, had won when conventional wisdom said they couldn't, had turned a backup quarterback and a dominant defense into championship gold. It was Raiders football at its finest, unconventional, defiant, succeeding through toughness and determination and a refusal to accept limitations. In the early 1980s, Al Davis did something that would forever alter the Raiders' identity and set off a chain of events that still reverberates through professional football today. He decided to move the team from Oakland to Los Angeles, and when the NFL tried to stop him, Davis did what Raiders had always done. He fought back, refused to accept limitations, and ultimately got his way through sheer force of will and a successful lawsuit against the league itself. The reasons for the move were complicated, rooted in disputes over stadium improvements in Oakland and the lure of the massive Los Angeles market. The Coliseum in Oakland was aging, and Davis wanted upgrades, wanted luxury boxes and modern amenities that would generate more revenue. When those improvements weren't forthcoming to his satisfaction, Davis began looking elsewhere. Los Angeles had lost both the Rams and the Chargers in previous years. The Rams were still there, but would eventually leave, and the market was hungry for professional football. The LA Memorial Coliseum, the historic stadium that had hosted 2 Olympic Games and countless Rose Bowls, was available and enormous, seating over 90,000 fans. But the NFL had rules about franchise relocation, required league approval for teams to move. When Davis announced his intention to relocate to Los Angeles, the other NFL owners voted against it, denied him permission, told him the Raiders would stay in Oakland. Most owners would have accepted that decision, would have worked within the system to address their concerns. But Al Davis wasn't most owners. He was a Raider, through and through, and Raiders didn't accept being told no when they believed they were right. Davis sued the NFL, arguing that the league's restrictions on franchise movement violated antitrust laws, that owners should have the freedom to relocate their teams when it made business sense. The lawsuit was contentious, bitter, pitting Davis against his fellow owners, against the commissioner, against the entire structure of the league. But Davis had always been willing to fight, to stand alone if necessary, to be the rebel even among rebels. The trial lasted months, with testimony about league rules, business practices, the nature of professional sports franchises as businesses versus community institutions. In 1982, Davis won. The court ruled in his favor, found that the NFL's relocation restrictions were indeed anti-competitive. The Raiders were free to move to Los Angeles, and there was nothing the league could do to stop them. It was a landmark victory, one that would change how franchise relocation worked in professional sports going forward. But it also created lasting enmity between Davis and many other owners, between the Raiders and the league office, a tension that would persist for decades. The move itself was wrenching for Oakland. The city had embraced the Raiders, had supported them through the early struggling years, and celebrated with them through the championships. The Black Hole, that legendary section of passionate fans, was an Oakland creation rooted in the city's identity. Now the team was leaving, taking the silver and black to Los Angeles, and Oakland was left with an empty stadium and a sense of betrayal that would never completely heal. But in Los Angeles, the Raiders found a new home and a new fan base eager to embrace them. The LA Memorial Coliseum was enormous, historic, with a grandeur that the Oakland Coliseum had never possessed. The Los Angeles Raiders. It sounded strange at first, that combination of city and team name that had been synonymous with Oakland for over 20 years. But the identity remained. These were still the Raiders, still wore silver and black, still played with that physical, intimidating style. The uniform hadn't changed, the attitude hadn't changed, the commitment to excellence hadn't changed. Only the location was different. The team that took the field in Los Angeles was formidable. Jim Plunkett was still at quarterback, having resurrected his career with that 1980 Super Bowl run. The defense remained dominant, physical, intimidating. And the Raiders had added a young running back who would become one of the greatest ever to play the position, Marcus Allen. Allen had been drafted in 1982, a Heisman Trophy winner from USC who had starred just miles from the Coliseum. He was smooth, patient, possessed exceptional vision that allowed him to find holes in defenses that other running backs couldn't see. Allen could run inside with power, could bounce outside with speed, could catch passes out of the backfield, could do everything a modern running back needed to do. He was perfect for the Raiders' offense, gave them a dimension they hadn't had in years. The 1983 season was dominant from the start. The Raiders, now firmly established in Los Angeles, won game after game, finishing the regular season with a 12-4 record. They were the best team in the AFC, perhaps the best team in the entire NFL. Marcus Allen rushed for over 1,000 yards, combining with Jim Plunkett's efficient passing to create an offense that was balanced and dangerous. The defense continued to intimidate, to hit hard, to create turnovers, and give the offense short fields. When the playoffs arrived, the Raiders were ready. They hadn't been a wild card this time. They were division champions, one of the top seeds, playing with the confidence of a team that knew it was special. They won their first playoff game convincingly, then won the AFC Championship, advancing to Super Bowl XVIII, where they would face the Washington Redskins, a powerful team with their own championship aspirations. The Super Bowl was played in Tampa, and what unfolded that January afternoon was a masterclass in dominant football. The Raiders didn't just beat Washington, they crushed them, demolished them, left no doubt about which team was superior. The final score was 38-9, a blowout that was even more lopsided than the numbers suggested. The Raiders scored early, scored often, and the Redskins never had a chance to make it competitive. Marcus Allen rushed for 191 yards, a Super Bowl record, and 2 touchdowns. But one of those touchdowns became legendary, one of the most famous plays in Super Bowl history. Late in the third quarter, with the game still somewhat in doubt, Allen took a handoff on the Raiders' own goal line, started running to the left, found the hole blocked, reversed field all the way back to the right side, and then, impossibly, magically, found open space and raced 74 yards for a touchdown. 74 yards from his own goal line to the opposite end zone, a run that showcased his patience, his vision, his acceleration, his ability to make something extraordinary out of what should have been a routine play. That run became iconic, replayed thousands of times, a perfect encapsulation of Marcus Allen's brilliance. Allen was named Super Bowl MVP, joining a list of Raiders who had earned that honor. Bart Starr in Super Bowl II when the Raiders lost, Ken Stabler and Jim Plunkett in the Raiders' previous Super Bowl victories, and now Allen. Another championship, another MVP, another dominating performance on football's biggest stage. For Al Davis, this championship had special meaning. He had fought the entire NFL to move the team to Los Angeles, had been vilified for it, had been called a traitor to Oakland and a destroyer of tradition. But he had won that fight, had moved the team, and now, just 2 years after the move, the Los Angeles Raiders were Super Bowl champions. It was vindication, proof that his decision had been right, that the Raiders could thrive in Los Angeles, that disruption and controversy and fighting the establishment could lead to success. For Tom Flores, this was his second Super Bowl championship as head coach in just 4 years. He had proven that the 1980 Wild Card Championship wasn't a fluke, that he could build championship teams, that he deserved to be mentioned alongside the great coaches in Raiders history. Flores had done it with different rosters, different circumstances. One championship as a wild card with a backup quarterback, another as a dominant top seed with a superstar running back. His adaptability, his ability to maximize whatever talent he had available, marked him as a truly great coach. For Marcus Allen, this was the beginning of a Hall of Fame career, the announcement that a new star had arrived, that the Raiders had found another legendary player to add to their rich history. That 74-yard touchdown run would define him, would be shown every time his career was discussed, would become part of the permanent highlight reel of Super Bowl greatness. The Los Angeles Raiders had won their third Super Bowl championship, their second in 4 years, proving that the franchise's success transcended location, that whether they played in Oakland or Los Angeles, they were still the Raiders, still committed to excellence, still capable of winning at the highest level. The move had been controversial, painful for Oakland, contentious with the league. But on the field, in the only place that ultimately mattered to Al Davis, the Raiders had validated the decision by winning another championship. The silver and black now belonged to Los Angeles, at least for this era. The Memorial Coliseum would host Raiders games, would see its own version of the black hole develop, would witness more victories and playoff runs in the years to come. Oakland had lost its team, but the Raiders' identity remained intact. They were still rebels, still winners, still the franchise that did things their own way regardless of what anyone else thought. After the glory of Super Bowl XVIII, after Marcus Allen's legendary 74-yard touchdown run and the dominant 38-9 victory, the Los Angeles Raiders stood at the pinnacle of professional football. They were champions, had one of the game's brightest young stars in Allen, had proven that the move to Los Angeles had been the right decision. The future seemed bright, seemed to promise more championships, more excellence, more years of dominance. But what followed instead was a slow, painful fracture, a period when egos clashed, relationships deteriorated, and the winning culture that Al Davis had built over 2 decades began to crack. The 1985 season saw Marcus Allen at his absolute peak. He rushed for over 1,000 yards, scored touchdowns, made plays that reminded everyone why he had been Super Bowl MVP just a year earlier. Allen's combination of power and grace, his patience as a runner, his ability to make defenders miss in the open field, all of it was on full display. At season's end, Marcus Allen was named the NFL's most valuable player, the highest individual honor a player can receive, recognition that he was the best player in the entire league. For most franchises, having the league MVP on your roster would be a cause for celebration, a foundation to build around, a player to feature and support in pursuit of more championships. But the relationship between Marcus Allen and Al Davis, which should have been a partnership between star player and visionary owner, began to deteriorate in ways that were petty, destructive, and ultimately harmful to both men and to the franchise they both loved. The origins of the feud were never entirely clear, at least not publicly. There were rumors, whispers, suggestions about what had caused the rift. Some said Davis felt Allen was too individualistic, too concerned with his own statistics and accolades rather than team success. Others suggested contractual disputes, disagreements about money and Allen's value to the franchise. Still others pointed to simple personality conflicts, two strong-willed men who couldn't coexist peacefully, whose egos were too large to share the spotlight. Whatever the cause, the feud became public, ugly, damaging. Davis, who had always controlled the Raiders with an iron hand, who had never hesitated to make personnel decisions based on what he believed was best for the franchise, began limiting Allen's playing time. Allen, the reigning NFL MVP, the Super Bowl hero, found himself on the sideline more often than on the field, watching as other running backs carried the ball in situations where he should have been the obvious choice. It was bizarre, counterproductive, the kind of decision that only made sense if you understood it as punishment rather than football strategy. Davis was sending a message, asserting his control, making clear that no player, not even the NFL MVP, was bigger than the Raiders, bigger than Al Davis himself. But the message came at a cost. The team was worse without Allen on the field, was depriving itself of one of the league's best players for reasons that had nothing to do with football and everything to do with ego and power. Allen, proud and accomplished, refused to simply accept the situation quietly. He spoke to the media, expressed frustration with his diminished role, made clear that he believed he was being treated unfairly. The feud became a running story, a soap opera that overshadowed the team's on-field performance, that created division in the locker room, that turned what should have been the Raiders' golden era with an MVP running back into a dysfunctional mess. And as the personal drama played out, the team's performance began to slide. The Raiders, who had been perennial contenders throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, who had won 3 Super Bowls in 8 years, started losing more than they won. Playoff appearances became less frequent, then stopped altogether. Losing seasons followed, something that had been almost unthinkable during the glory years, something that violated everything Al Davis had built the franchise to be. Part of the decline was natural aging. The players who had won those championships in 1980 and 1983 were getting older, slower, less effective. The defensive stars who had intimidated opponents were retiring or declining. Jim Plunkett, who had led those Super Bowl runs, was nearing the end of his career. Roster turnover is inevitable in professional sports, and the Raiders were experiencing it after years of sustained excellence. But the Marcus Allen situation made everything worse, created instability and distraction that hampered the team's ability to rebuild effectively. Young players joining the Raiders saw their franchise running back, their MVP, sitting on the bench or being used sparingly, and they had to wonder what kind of organization they had joined, whether individual excellence would be rewarded or punished depending on Al Davis's mood. Tom Flores, who had coached the team to 2 Super Bowl championships, who had proven himself one of the best coaches in football, departed after the 1987 season. His leaving ended a golden era of Raiders coaching that had begun with John Madden in 1969 and had produced 3 Super Bowl titles across nearly 2 decades. Flores was tired, perhaps worn down by the losing, by the drama, by the difficulty of coaching a team where the owner's ego sometimes seemed to matter more than winning. The coaching change brought new faces, new systems, but not new success. The Raiders continued to struggle, continued to post losing records, continued to fall further from the standard of excellence that had defined them for so long. The late 1980s became a time of wandering in the wilderness, of searching for an identity, of trying to figure out how to be the Raiders when winning had stopped being the norm. Marcus Allen eventually left, was traded to the Kansas City Chiefs in 1993, where he would resurrect his career and prove that he still had plenty of football left to play. The feud with Davis never truly healed. Both men went to their graves with hard feelings about what had happened, about opportunities wasted, about a relationship that should have been productive and celebratory, but instead became destructive and sad. Looking back, the mid to late 1980s stand as a cautionary tale about what happens when egos overwhelm common sense, when personal conflicts are prioritized over team success, when winning takes a backseat to power struggles and pride. The Raiders had everything they needed to continue their dominance: an MVP running back, a proven coach, a culture of excellence built over decades. But they squandered it, allowed personal feuds and ego to undermine what should have been another golden era. For Al Davis, who had built the Raiders into a championship franchise through sheer force of will, who had coined commitment to excellence and lived by it for decades, this period represented a departure from his own principles. The commitment to excellence had always meant putting winning first, making whatever decisions were necessary to field the best team. But in the Marcus Allen feud, Davis allowed personal feelings to override football sense, allowed ego to trump excellence, and the franchise suffered for it. For the fans who had supported the Raiders through the move from Oakland, who had embraced the team in Los Angeles, who had celebrated that Super Bowl XVIII championship, the late 1980s were disappointing, confusing, frustrating. They had seen what the Raiders could be, had watched them dominate just a few years earlier. Now they were watching losing seasons, watching their MVP running back waste away on the bench, watching the magic that had defined the franchise seem to evaporate. The silver and black still meant something, the Raiders' identity, Their outlaw mystique, their rebel reputation remained. But identity without winning feels hollow. Reputation without excellence becomes just history. Mystique without playoff appearances fades into nostalgia for better days. The Raiders of the late 1980s were living on past glory, talking about championships they had won years ago rather than competing for new ones. It was a difficult period, a time of fracture and decline, a reminder that even the greatest franchises can stumble, that sustained excellence requires not just talent and coaching, but also organizational harmony, wise decision-making, the ability to put winning ahead of personal pride. The Raiders had lost their way, had allowed the very things that had made them great, strong personalities, refusal to compromise, fierce independence, to become liabilities when directed inward rather than toward defeating opponents. In 1989, Al Davis made a decision that would resonate far beyond the Raiders organization, that would represent progress for professional football and for American sports in general. He hired Art Shell as head coach, making Shell the first black head coach in the modern NFL. It was a groundbreaking appointment, a barrier broken at a time when coaching opportunities for black candidates remained frustratingly limited despite the fact that the majority of players in the league were black. Art Shell was a Raiders legend, had been one of those 8 Hall of Famers on the 1976 Super Bowl championship team. He had played offensive tackle with a dominance and consistency that made him one of the best ever at his position, had protected Raiders quarterbacks for years, had been part of that incredible run of excellence in the 1970s and early 1980s. Shell understood the Raiders' culture from the inside, had lived it as a player, embodied the toughness and commitment to excellence that defined the franchise. For Davis, hiring Shell was both a statement and a practical decision. The statement was clear. Merit mattered more than anything else, and Shell had earned the opportunity through his knowledge of the game, his leadership qualities, his understanding of what it meant to be a Raider. The practical aspect was equally important. Davis believed Shell could restore the winning culture that had slipped away during the late 1980s, could reconnect the team to its championship roots. Shell's appointment was celebrated beyond the Raiders' fan base. It represented progress, an acknowledgement that coaching ability had nothing to do with race, that black coaches deserved the same opportunities as their white counterparts. The significance wasn't lost on Shell himself, who understood he was carrying not just the Raiders' hopes, but also the aspirations of countless black coaches who hoped his success would open more doors. Under Shell's leadership, the Raiders began to stabilize, to reclaim some of the competitive edge that had defined them for so long. They weren't dominant the way they had been in their championship years, weren't the intimidating force that had terrorized the league in the 1970s and early 1980s. But they were competitive again, were making playoff appearances, were giving their fans reason to believe that the Raiders could be contenders once more. The 1990 season brought a playoff berth, the Raiders' first in several years. It was progress, validation that Shell was the right choice, that the franchise was moving in the right direction. The playoff run was ultimately short. They lost in the AFC Championship game, but reaching that level again felt like an achievement after the struggles of the late 1980s. The Raiders were back, not all the way back to championship form, but back among the teams that mattered, that competed in January, that had a chance. During these years, the Raiders featured one of the most electrifying and tragic athletes professional sports has ever seen. Bo Jackson was a phenomenon, a two-sport star who played both professional football for the Raiders and professional baseball for the Kansas City Royals. Jackson possessed physical gifts that seemed almost superhuman, speed that a man his size shouldn't have, power that could break tackles or hit home runs, athleticism that made the impossible look routine. Watching Bo Jackson run with a football was mesmerizing. He would take handoffs, accelerate to full speed in just a few steps, run over defenders who tried to tackle him high, run past defenders who took bad angles, sometimes run through defenders who hit him square and somehow bounced off. Jackson's Monday Night Football run against the Seattle Seahawks, where he ran 91 yards for a touchdown, showcased everything that made him special: the speed, the power, the almost casual way he made elite athletes look slow and weak. But Jackson's two-sport career meant his body was under constant stress, never getting the rest that single-sport athletes enjoyed. And in January 1991, during a playoff game, Bo Jackson suffered a hip injury that would ultimately end his football career, and severely limit his baseball career. The injury seemed routine at first, just a hard tackle, but the damage was severe. The hip socket was injured in a way that would lead to avascular necrosis, essentially the death of bone tissue, a devastating condition for any athlete, but particularly for someone whose game depended on explosive speed and power. Bo Jackson would never play football again after that injury. His baseball career limped along for a few more years, but he was never the same. Never again the superhuman athlete who had captivated sports fans across the country. It was a tragedy, potential cut short, excellence ended prematurely. Jackson's time with the Raiders had been brief. He had only played parts of 4 seasons, but he had been spectacular, had given fans memories they would cherish forever, had shown what peak athleticism looked like. The early 1990s also saw the retirement of other Raiders legends. Howie Long, the defensive end who had been part of the Super Bowl XVIII championship team, who had terrorized quarterbacks for 13 seasons, retired after the 1993 season. Long had been one of the last connections to the championship era, one of the few remaining players who had experienced Raiders' glory firsthand. His retirement symbolized the end of that generation, the final closing of the championship window that had opened in the mid-1970s. For the fans who had supported the Raiders through the move from Oakland, who had embraced the team in Los Angeles, who had celebrated that Super Bowl XVIII championship, the late 1980s were disappointing, confusing, frustrating. They had seen what the Raiders could be, had watched them dominate just a few years earlier. Now they were watching losing seasons, watching their MVP running back waste away on the bench, watching the magic that had defined the franchise seem to evaporate. The silver and black still meant something. The Raiders' identity, their outlaw mystique, their rebel reputation remained. But identity without winning feels hollow. Reputation without excellence becomes just history. Mystique without playoff appearances fades into nostalgia for better days. The Raiders of the late 1980s were living on past glory, talking about championships they had won years ago rather than competing for new ones. It was a difficult period, a time of fracture and decline, a reminder that even the greatest franchises can stumble, that sustained excellence requires not just talent and coaching, but also organizational harmony, wise decision-making, the ability to put winning ahead of personal pride. The Raiders had lost their way, had allowed the very things that had made them great, strong personalities, refusal to compromise, fierce independence, to become liabilities when directed inward rather than toward defeating opponents. In 1989, Al Davis made a decision that would resonate far beyond the Raiders organization, that would represent progress for professional football and for American sports in general. He hired Art Shell as head coach, making Shell the first black head coach in the modern NFL. It was a groundbreaking appointment, a barrier broken at a time when coaching opportunities for black candidates remained frustratingly limited despite the fact that the majority of players in the league were black. Art Shell was a Raiders legend, had been one of those 8 Hall of Famers on the 1976 Super Bowl championship team. He had played offensive tackle with a dominance and consistency that made him one of the best ever at his position, had protected Raiders quarterbacks for years, had been part of that incredible run of excellence in the 1970s and early 1980s. Shell understood the Raiders' culture from the inside, had lived it as a player, embodied the toughness and commitment to excellence that defined the franchise. For Davis, hiring Shell was both a statement and a practical decision. The statement was clear. Merit mattered more than anything else, and Shell had earned the opportunity through his knowledge of the game, his leadership qualities, his understanding of what it meant to be a Raider. The practical aspect was equally important. Davis believed Shell could restore the winning culture that had slipped away during the late 1980s, could reconnect the team to its championship roots. Shell's appointment was celebrated beyond the Raiders' fan base. It represented progress, an acknowledgement that coaching ability had nothing to do with race, that black coaches deserved the same opportunities as their white counterparts. The significance wasn't lost on Shell himself, who understood he was carrying not just the Raiders' hopes, but also the aspirations of countless black coaches who hoped his success would open more doors. Under Shell's leadership, the Raiders began to stabilize, to reclaim some of the competitive edge that had defined them for so long. They weren't dominant the way they had been in their championship years, weren't the intimidating force that had terrorized the league in the 1970s and early 1980s. But they were competitive again, were making playoff appearances, were giving their fans reason to believe that the Raiders could be contenders once more. The 1990 season brought a playoff berth, the Raiders' first in several years. It was progress, validation that Shell was the right choice, that the franchise was moving in the right direction. The playoff run was ultimately short. They lost in the AFC Championship game. But reaching that level again felt like an achievement after the struggles of the late 1980s. The Raiders were back, not all the way back to championship form, but back among the teams that mattered, that competed in January, that had a chance. During these years, the Raiders featured one of the most electrifying and tragic athletes professional sports has ever seen. Bo Jackson was a phenomenon, a two-sport star who played both professional football for the Raiders and professional baseball for the Kansas City Royals. Jackson possessed physical gifts that seemed almost superhuman, speed that a man his size shouldn't have, power that could break tackles or hit home runs, athleticism that made the impossible look routine. Watching Bo Jackson run with a football was mesmerizing. He would take handoffs, accelerate to full speed in just a few steps, run over defenders who tried to tackle him high, run past defenders who took bad angles, sometimes run through defenders who hit him square and somehow bounced off. Jackson's Monday Night Football run against the Seattle Seahawks, where he ran 91 yards for a touchdown, showcased everything that made him special: the speed, the power, the almost casual way he made elite athletes look slow and weak. But Jackson's two-sport career meant his body was under constant stress, never getting the rest that single-sport athletes enjoyed. And in January 1991, during a playoff game, Bo Jackson suffered a hip injury that would ultimately end his football career and severely limit his baseball career. The injury seemed routine at first, just a hard tackle, but the damage was severe. The hip socket was injured in a way that would lead to avascular necrosis, essentially the death of bone tissue, a devastating condition for any athlete, but particularly for someone whose game depended on explosive speed and power. Bo Jackson would never play football again after that injury. His baseball career limped along for a few more years, but he was never the same. Never again the superhuman athlete who had captivated sports fans across the country. It was a tragedy, potential cut short, excellence ended prematurely. Jackson's time with the Raiders had been brief. He had only played parts of 4 seasons, but he had been spectacular, had given fans memories they would cherish forever, had shown what peak athleticism looked like. The early 1990s also saw the retirement of other Raiders legends. Howie Long, the defensive end who had been part of the Super Bowl XVIII championship team, who had terrorized quarterbacks for 13 seasons, retired after the 1993 season. Long had been one of the last connections to the championship era, one of the few remaining players who had experienced Raiders' glory firsthand. His retirement symbolized the end of that generation, the final closing of the championship window that had opened in the mid-1970s. The 1993 season brought another playoff appearance, another brief moment of hope that maybe the Raiders could recapture their former glory. But the postseason run was again short, the team still not quite good enough to compete with the NFL's elite, still searching for the combination of talent and chemistry and luck needed to make a serious championship run. Behind the scenes, bigger changes were brewing. The relationship between Al Davis and Los Angeles had soured. The Memorial Coliseum, while historic and enormous, was aging and lacked the luxury boxes and modern amenities that generated revenue for other teams. Attendance, which had been strong initially, had declined as the team struggled through losing seasons. And Oakland, which had never stopped feeling betrayed by the Raiders' departure, was making overtures about the team returning, offering stadium improvements and financial incentives. In 1995, the Raiders made the decision to return to Oakland. After 13 years in Los Angeles, after a Super Bowl championship and memorable moments at the Memorial Coliseum, after building a fan base in Southern California, the Raiders were going home. For Oakland, it was vindication, a prodigal son returning. For Los Angeles, it was another abandonment, another team leaving, another reminder that professional sports franchises are businesses that will move when it suits their financial interests. The return to Oakland would mark the beginning of a new era, but it would also close this chapter, the Los Angeles years that had begun with controversy and a lawsuit, that had produced a championship and Marcus Allen's legendary run, that had featured Bo Jackson's brief but spectacular career and Art Shell's groundbreaking tenure as coach. Art Shell's time as head coach ended with the move back to Oakland, his tenure evaluated as successful in restoring some competitive respectability, but ultimately falling short of championships. He had broken barriers, had handled the pressure and responsibility of being the first with dignity and professionalism, had shown that black coaches could succeed at the highest level of professional football. Other opportunities for black coaches would follow, though progress would remain frustratingly slow. But Shell had been first, had carried that weight, had done it while also trying to return the Raiders to championship contention. These years from 1989 through 1994, the final Oakland push before the return, were a mix of progress and limitations, of groundbreaking achievements and tragic endings, of playoff appearances that fell short and legends retiring. The Raiders had stabilized under Art Shell, had been competitive without being dominant, had featured spectacular talents like Bo Jackson, whose careers ended too soon. They had remained the Raiders, still wearing silver and black, still playing physical football, still carrying that outlaw identity, but they hadn't recaptured the championship magic that had defined them in earlier decades. As they prepared to return to Oakland in 1995, the Raiders stood at another crossroads. A new stadium awaited, or rather a renovated version of their old home. A new chapter was beginning, though whether it would bring a return to glory or continued frustration remained to be seen. The Los Angeles era was ending, remembered for both its triumphs and its disappointments, for a Super Bowl won and potential squandered, for barriers broken and careers ended too soon. The return to Oakland in 1995 should have been triumphant, a homecoming that energized the franchise and reconnected the Raiders with the passionate fan base that had never stopped loving them despite the 13-year absence. The renovated Oakland Alameda County Coliseum awaited, expanded and improved with luxury boxes and modern facilities. The city welcomed the Raiders back with open arms, eager to forgive the abandonment, ready to fill the stands and recreate that intimidating atmosphere that had once made Oakland one of the most difficult places in the NFL for visiting teams to play. But the reunion, while emotionally satisfying for the fans who had waited so long, did not translate into success on the field. The Raiders of the mid to late 1990s were not the Raiders of the championship years, were not even the competitive teams that Art Shell had coached in the early 1990s. Instead, they were a franchise adrift, making poor personnel decisions, struggling to find the right players and coaches, watching as year after year brought more disappointment, more losing, more frustration. The aging stars who had carried the team through the early 1990s were gone or declining rapidly. The roster needed to be rebuilt, required an infusion of young talent through the draft and smart free agent signings. But the Raiders' draft picks during this period were, with painful frequency, failures, players who flamed out quickly, who never developed into the stars they were projected to be, who represented wasted opportunities and years of futility. Todd Marinovich became the most infamous example of the Raiders' draft failures during this era. Marinovich had been a highly touted quarterback from USC, had been groomed from childhood by his father to be a football player, had shown flashes of brilliance in college. The Raiders selected him in the first round of the 1991 draft, believing they had found their quarterback of the future, the player who would lead them back to championship contention. But Marinovich was troubled, struggled with substance abuse, couldn't handle the pressure and demands of professional football. His time with the Raiders was brief and disastrous. He started just 8 games over 2 seasons, showed little of the potential that had made him a first-round pick, and was out of the NFL entirely by 1993. The Marinovich pick became a cautionary tale about the dangers of projecting college success to the professional level, about how personal issues can derail even the most talented athletes, about how a single draft mistake can set a franchise back years. And Marinovich wasn't the only draft disappointment. Year after year, the Raiders used high picks on players who failed to develop, who got injured, who simply weren't good enough to compete at the NFL level. The draft, which should have been the primary mechanism for rebuilding the roster, became instead a litany of failures, of opportunities wasted, of the gap between the Raiders and the league's elite teams growing wider rather than narrowing. Injuries plagued the roster too, striking down players who might have been building blocks for the future, creating instability and forcing the team to constantly adjust, to plug holes with replacement-level players who couldn't maintain competitiveness. Football is a violent sport. Injuries are inevitable, But the Raiders seemed to suffer more than their fair share during these years, losing key players at crucial moments, watching potential seasons slip away because the roster couldn't stay healthy. The coaching situation was unstable as well. After Art Shell's departure, the Raiders cycled through coaches, each bringing new systems, new philosophies, new promises that this time would be different. But the coaching changes only added to the instability, prevented the team from developing continuity, from building an identity, from executing any single system well enough to overcome the talent deficiencies. Al Davis, now in his 60s and 70s, remained in control of the franchise, still making personnel decisions, still believing in his ability to build winners the way he had in the 1970s and 1980s. But the game had changed, and Davis's approach, while revolutionary in earlier decades, was struggling to adapt to the modern NFL. The league had implemented a salary cap in 1994, limiting teams' ability to simply outspend rivals for free agents. The draft had become more sophisticated, with teams using advanced scouting and analytics. The Raiders, under Davis's control, seemed stuck in the past, trying to recreate the glory years using outdated methods that no longer worked in the contemporary NFL. The late 1990s brought no relief from the struggles. Season after season, the Raiders posted losing records, missed the playoffs, gave their fans little reason for hope. The passionate supporters who had welcomed the team back to Oakland in 1995 remained loyal. The black hole continued to exist. Fans still wore their silver and black, still showed up to games. But their optimism had been worn down by years of disappointment, by watching their team consistently lose, by seeing other franchises build dynasties while the Raiders languished. There were occasional bright spots, individual players who performed well despite the team's overall struggles. Tim Brown, a wide receiver who had been with the team since 1988, continued to be productive, catching passes and scoring touchdowns even when the offense around him was mediocre. Brown's consistency, his professionalism, his ability to perform at a high level year after year despite the chaos around him, made him a fan favorite, a connection to better days, a reminder that excellence was still possible even in difficult circumstances. But individual excellence couldn't compensate for team-wide dysfunction. Football is the ultimate team sport, requires coordination and execution from all 11 players on every play. Having one great receiver or one talented defensive player wasn't enough when the roster as a whole was inadequate, when the coaching was inconsistent, when the organization seemed to lack direction. By the end of the decade, as the millennium approached, the Oakland Raiders were drifting. They had no clear identity beyond their historical reputation, no obvious path forward, no young stars emerging who could carry them to championship contention. The franchise that had won 3 Super Bowls in the 1970s and 1980s, that had been feared and respected throughout the league, that had embodied excellence and toughness, and that outlaw mystique, was now just another struggling team, notable mainly for past glory rather than present competitiveness. The silver and black still meant something to the fans who wore it, to the players who had once starred in those colors, to the history of professional football. But history doesn't win games. Nostalgia doesn't earn playoff berths. And the Raiders of the late 1990s were learning the painful lesson that reputation without performance is hollow, that you can't win on legacy alone, that every era must earn its own success rather than living off the achievements of previous generations. These lost years, these false dawns when draft picks promised hope only to flame out, when seasons began with optimism only to end in disappointment, when the return to Oakland had rekindled emotions but not victories. These were difficult times for everyone associated with the franchise. For Al Davis, who had built something magnificent and was watching it decline despite his efforts to restore it. For the players, who wore the uniform but couldn't replicate the success of their predecessors. For the coaches, who cycled through knowing they would likely be fired when the losing continued. And most of all, for the fans, who remained loyal even when loyalty brought more pain than joy, who kept believing even when belief seemed foolish, who held on to memories of championships while enduring seasons of futility. The 1990s were ending, a lost decade for the Raiders, years that had promised so much. The return to Oakland, the reunion with passionate fans, the opportunity to rebuild and restore the franchise to glory, but had delivered so little. The new millennium approached, and with it, eventually, would come one more chance at redemption, one more opportunity to prove that the Raiders could be great again. But that was still ahead, still waiting in an uncertain future. For now, as the decade closed, the Raiders were simply struggling, drifting, searching for answers that remained frustratingly elusive. After years of wandering in the wilderness, after a decade of disappointment and failed rebuilds, after watching the glory years recede further and further into memory, the Oakland Raiders suddenly, unexpectedly, roared back to life at the turn of the millennium. It wasn't a gradual improvement, wasn't a slow climb back to respectability. It was a transformation, almost overnight, from a struggling franchise to championship contenders once more. And leading this renaissance was an unlikely hero, a quarterback named Rich Gannon who had journeyed through his own wilderness before finding stardom in Oakland. Rich Gannon was 34 years old when he joined the Raiders in 1999, an age when most quarterbacks are contemplating retirement rather than entering their prime. He had been a journeyman, bouncing around the league, showing flashes of talent, but never quite establishing himself as a star. The Raiders were his fourth team, and conventional wisdom suggested he would be a placeholder, a veteran presence while the team developed a younger quarterback for the future. But something happened when Gannon arrived in Oakland, when he was paired with a new offensive coordinator named John Gruden, who had innovative ideas about how to use Gannon's mobility and quick decision-making. Gruden's system emphasized short, quick passes, getting the ball out rapidly to playmakers who could create yards after the catch. It was perfect for Gannon, who processed information quickly, had the accuracy to hit receivers in stride, and still possessed enough athleticism to extend plays with his legs. The transformation was remarkable. By 2000, Gannon was playing the best football of his life, and the Raiders were winning again, competing again, looking like the Raiders of old. That season, Gannon threw for over 3,800 yards and 28 touchdowns, orchestrating an offense that was efficient and explosive. The Raiders made the playoffs, won a wild-card game, and advanced to the AFC Championship game. One game away from the Super Bowl, one game from a chance at the championship that had eluded them since 1983. Rich Gannon was named NFL MVP for the 2000 season, an extraordinary achievement for a 35-year-old journeyman who had spent most of his career in obscurity. It was validation, redemption, proof that careers can have second acts, that the right situation and the right system can unlock potential that seemed dormant or lost. Gannon's story resonated with Raiders fans, fit perfectly with the franchise's identity. Here was another cast-off, another player discarded by other teams, thriving in Oakland where misfits had always found homes. The AFC Championship game that year was heartbreaking. The Raiders played well, fought hard, but ultimately fell short against the Baltimore Ravens, who went on to win the Super Bowl. It was devastating to come so close, to have the season end one game short of the ultimate goal. But there was also hope, belief that this team was building something, that the 2000 season wasn't a fluke but the beginning of a sustained run of excellence, that the Raiders were back among the NFL's elite. John Gruden, the young offensive coordinator who had helped transform Rich Gannon and the Raiders' offense, was promoted to head coach. At just 34 years old, Gruden brought energy and innovation, a mind for offensive football that could create advantages, that could scheme players open, that could maximize the talents of his roster. The 2001 season brought more success, another playoff appearance, proof that the Raiders' resurgence was sustainable. And then came 2002, the season when everything came together perfectly, when the Raiders achieved a level of dominance they hadn't reached since the championship years. Rich Gannon, now 37 years old, was playing even better than he had in his MVP season. The offense, running Gruden's system under new head coach Bill Callahan, Gruden had been traded to Tampa Bay in a shocking move before the season, was the best in the AFC. The defense, rebuilt and rejuvenated, was playing with the physicality and aggression that had always defined Raiders football. The Raiders dominated the 2002 regular season, winning game after game, establishing themselves as the best team in the AFC. When the season ended, Oakland's record stood at 11-5, but more importantly, they had earned the AFC's top seed, home field advantage throughout the playoffs. The Black Hole was loud and passionate, the Coliseum intimidating once more, and the Raiders were favored to reach the Super Bowl, to have that chance at a championship that had been so long in coming. The playoffs brought decisive victories. The Raiders won at home, advanced through the AFC bracket, reached the AFC Championship game once again. And this time, unlike in 2000, they won. They were going to Super Bowl 37, their first Super Bowl appearance in 19 years, a chance to win the franchise's fourth championship, to validate everything that Al Davis had been trying to rebuild for 2 decades. Rich Gannon, at age 37, was going to play in the Super Bowl. Tim Brown, the wide receiver who had been with the Raiders through all the lean years, who had remained loyal and productive through a decade of losing, was finally getting his chance to play for a championship. The entire organization, from Al Davis down through the coaches and players, was one game away from glory, from redemption, from proving that the Raiders could still be champions. But the opponent in Super Bowl 37 brought a cruel irony that seemed almost scripted for maximum drama and pain. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, led by head coach John Gruden, the same John Gruden who had been the Raiders' coach just a year earlier, who had installed the offensive system Rich Gannon was running, who knew every tendency, every play call, every nuance of Oakland's offense because he had created it. The trade that had sent Gruden to Tampa Bay had been shocking, controversial, one of Al Davis's decisions that many questioned. Gruden and Davis had clashed over control, over personnel decisions, over the usual power struggles that seemed to follow Davis throughout his career. Rather than resolve their differences, Davis had traded Gruden to Tampa Bay for draft picks and cash, believing the Raiders could win with Bill Callahan running the system Gruden had installed. And the Raiders had won, had earned the top seed, had reached the Super Bowl. But now they faced their former coach, the man who knew their offense better than anyone, who could anticipate their plays before they developed, who had spent a year preparing Tampa Bay's defense to stop exactly the system he had designed. The Super Bowl, played in San Diego, was a disaster for Oakland. From the opening drive, it was clear that Tampa Bay knew what was coming, was anticipating Oakland's plays, was reading Gannon's intentions before he even threw the ball. The Buccaneers intercepted Gannon 5 times. 5 interceptions in a Super Bowl, a devastating performance for a quarterback who had been so brilliant all season. Tampa Bay's defense, coached by Gruden and knowing Oakland's offense intimately, was everywhere, creating turnovers, scoring defensive touchdowns, turning what should have been Oakland's moment of glory into a nightmare. The final score was 48-21, but even that didn't capture how thoroughly Tampa Bay had dominated. The Raiders had been overwhelmed, outcoached, beaten by a man who had once been their coach, using knowledge of their system that he had gained while building it. It was cruel, ironic, perfectly fitting for a franchise whose history was filled with heartbreak and near misses. The Raiders had finally reached the Super Bowl after 19 years, had brought a 37-year-old journeyman quarterback to the biggest stage, had given their loyal fans a chance to celebrate a championship, and they had been crushed, humiliated, beaten soundly by the coach they had traded away. For Rich Gannon, who had played so brilliantly all season, who had earned MVP honors and led the Raiders back to prominence, the Super Bowl loss was a devastating end to a remarkable career renaissance. He would play one more injury-plagued season before retiring, his legacy forever marked by that Super Bowl performance, by those 5 interceptions, by the cruel irony of being beaten by the system he had executed so well all year. For Tim Brown, who had waited 14 years for a chance to play in a Super Bowl, who had remained loyal to the Raiders through all the losing seasons, the defeat was heartbreaking. He would never get another chance, would retire a few years later without a championship ring, his Hall of Fame career complete except for that one thing that had eluded him. For Al Davis, now in his 70s, this was perhaps his last realistic chance to win another Super Bowl as owner. The team had been dominant during the regular season, had earned the top seed, had everything in place to win the championship. But the decision to trade Gruden had come back to haunt him in the most public, painful way possible. The coach he had let go had beaten him on football's biggest stage, had used knowledge of the Raiders' system to systematically dismantle them. It was a failure that would define the final years of Davis's ownership, a what-if that would never be resolved. The 2000 to 2002 era, that brief window when the Raiders had been championship contenders again, when Rich Gannon had played MVP-caliber football, when Oakland had seemed on the verge of reclaiming its glory, ended with that Super Bowl loss. The team would decline rapidly afterward, would return to losing, would enter another long period of futility. Those 3 years, from Gannon's MVP season through the Super Bowl appearance, would stand as one last shot at glory, one final moment when the Raiders had been among the NFL's elite before sliding back into mediocrity. It was a bittersweet period, glory tinged with heartbreak, excellence ending in crushing defeat, hope fulfilled only to be dashed at the final moment. The Raiders had proven they could still be great, that they could still dominate, that the commitment to excellence Al Davis had instilled decades earlier could still produce championship-caliber teams. But they had also proven that being good enough to reach the Super Bowl and being good enough to win it are different things, that cruel ironies exist, that sometimes your own decisions, like trading away your coach, come back to devastate you in the most public way imaginable. After the devastation of Super Bowl 37, after watching John Gruden's Buccaneers systematically dismantle them on football's biggest stage, the Oakland Raiders didn't just decline, they collapsed. It wasn't a gradual slide back to mediocrity, wasn't a few years of rebuilding before returning to competitiveness. It was a free fall, a plunge into depths of futility that the franchise had rarely experienced even in its earliest struggling years. The brief window of excellence from 2000 to 2002 closed abruptly, and what followed was nearly a decade of darkness, of losing, of poor decisions compounding into disaster. Rich Gannon, 37 years old and coming off that 5-interception Super Bowl nightmare, tried to continue playing in 2003. But his body, which had held up remarkably well through his late career resurgence, finally betrayed him. Injuries mounted, his effectiveness diminished, and by 2004 his playing career was over. The quarterback who had won MVP and led the Raiders back to prominence was gone, and the team had no succession plan, no obvious replacement, no young quarterback ready to take over and maintain the excellence Gannon had provided. The coaching situation, never fully stable even during the successful years, became chaotic. Bill Callahan, who had led the team to that Super Bowl loss, was fired after just one more season. His replacement lasted barely longer. And so began a carousel of coaches, each arriving with promises of turning things around, each departing after failing to do so. Different systems, different philosophies, different voices in the locker room. The constant turnover prevented any continuity, any development of young players, any establishment of an identity beyond futility. The win totals told a grim story. Season after season, the Raiders lost far more games than they won. Some years they would win 4 or 5 games, showing just enough competitiveness to provide false hope. Other years were even worse. In 2006, the Raiders finished 2-14, winning just 2 games all season. It was the same dismal record they had posted in 1962 during their early struggling years, and again in 1979 before Bill Walsh. No, before Al Davis arrived in 1963. The symmetry was painful. The franchise that had been built to championship glory through Al Davis's vision had now, under that same leadership in his declining years, fallen to the same depths it had occupied before his arrival. The 2-14 season was repeated in 2009, another year of almost complete futility. 2 wins, 14 losses. Week after week of getting beaten, of watching opponents celebrate victories at the Raiders' expense, of fans staying home rather than witnessing the carnage in person. The black hole remained, those most dedicated fans still showing up in their costumes and face paint. But even their passion couldn't change the reality on the field. The Raiders were terrible, consistently terrible, among the worst teams in the NFL year after year. Al Davis, now in his 80s, remained in control of the franchise, still making personnel decisions despite clear evidence that his approach was no longer working. The game had passed him by in many ways, his emphasis on speed above all else, his preference for athletic measurables over football intelligence, his willingness to reach for players other teams didn't value. All of it had worked brilliantly in earlier decades, but was failing spectacularly now. And nowhere was this failure more apparent than in the 2007 NFL Draft, when the Raiders held the first overall pick and used it to select Jamarcus Russell, a quarterback from LSU who possessed all the physical tools, a cannon arm, size, mobility, but lacked the work ethic, dedication, and mental approach needed to succeed in professional football. Russell became one of the biggest draft busts in NFL history, perhaps the biggest. He was paid a massive contract, given every opportunity to succeed, handed the franchise quarterback role, and asked to lead the Raiders back to competitiveness. But Russell showed up to training camps overweight, unprepared, unmotivated. He couldn't read defenses, couldn't process information quickly enough, couldn't perform at the level his physical gifts suggested he should. There were stories about him not studying film, about coaches testing him by inserting old game footage and Russell not noticing, about a player who seemed to view professional football as a job he was entitled to rather than a privilege he needed to earn daily. Russell started 25 games over 3 seasons, won just 7 of them, threw more interceptions than touchdowns, and was out of the league by 2010. The Raiders had wasted the #1 overall pick, had tied up salary cap space in a player who contributed nothing, had set the franchise back years by missing the opportunity to select a quarterback, or any player, who could actually help them win. Russell's failure became symbolic of everything wrong with the Raiders during this era: poor evaluation, bad decisions, wasted resources, squandered opportunities. The losing was relentless, demoralizing, seemingly without end. Young players who showed promise often left in free agency, seeking opportunities with competitive teams rather than wasting their careers with the Raiders. Free agents who might have helped avoided Oakland, unwilling to sign with a franchise that seemed committed to losing, that had become a punchline, that represented career death for anyone who joined. But even in these dark years, there were occasional bright spots, individual achievements that reminded everyone that excellence could still exist even amid organizational chaos. Charles Woodson, the cornerback and safety who had won the Heisman Trophy at Michigan and had been a star in the NFL for years, returned to the Raiders in 2006 after spending time with Green Bay. Woodson was in his early 30s, past his physical prime according to conventional wisdom, but he played with an intelligence and intensity that made him effective despite any physical decline. In 2009, the same year the Raiders finished 2-14, Charles Woodson was named NFL Defensive Player of the Year. It was a remarkable achievement, an individual player excelling despite playing for one of the worst teams in the league. Woodson led the league in interceptions, made plays week after week, showed that he was still elite even as the team around him struggled. His award provided a moment of pride for Raiders fans, proof that the silver and black could still mean something, that excellence still mattered even when winning didn't happen. Tim Brown had retired after the 2004 season, ending his 16-year career with the Raiders without ever winning a championship. His loyalty through all the lean years, his productivity even during losing seasons, his professionalism and dedication made him beloved by fans and eventually earned him a place in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. But his retirement removed another connection to better days, another link to when the Raiders had been contenders. The Oakland Alameda County Coliseum, which had been renovated to lure the team back from Los Angeles, now regularly featured large sections of empty seats. The passionate fans remained loyal. This was Oakland, after all, where dedication to the Raiders ran deep. But casual fans stopped showing up, stopped investing emotionally in a team that provided nothing but disappointment. The atmosphere that had once been so intimidating, that had given the Raiders genuine home field advantage, dissipated. Visiting teams no longer feared coming to Oakland. The black hole remained, but its impact was diminished when surrounded by empty seats and resigned fans who expected to lose. These years from 2003 through 2010 represented the nadir of the Raiders' post-merger history. Worse than the late 1960s when they couldn't get past the AFL Championship. Worse than the late 1980s when ego and poor decisions led to decline. This was systematic, sustained failure, year after year of being among the league's worst teams, of draft picks that didn't work out, of coaching changes that didn't help, of a proud franchise reduced to irrelevance. For Al Davis, who had built the Raiders into champions, who had won 3 Super Bowls, who had fought the NFL and moved the team and created a dynasty, these final years must have been agonizing. He remained defiant publicly, still believed in his approach, still thought he could rebuild the Raiders to glory. But privately, he must have known, must have felt the weight of watching his life's work crumble, of seeing the franchise he loved become a cautionary tale rather than a model of excellence. The commitment to excellence that Davis had coined decades earlier seemed like a cruel joke now, words that mocked the reality of 2-14 seasons and the worst record in football. The outlaw mystique that had once been fearsome now felt like delusion, clinging to past glory while failing miserably in the present. The silver and black that had represented dominance and intimidation now represented futility and dysfunction. But Raiders fans, those who had stuck with the team through these terrible years, held on to hope because that's what fans do. They remembered the championships, the great players, the moments of glory. They believed, perhaps irrationally but sincerely, that the Raiders would rise again, that this darkness was temporary, that somewhere ahead the franchise would find its way back. They had weathered difficult periods before, the early 1960s, the late 1980s, the mid-1990s, and had eventually seen better days return. Surely this time would be no different. Surely the Raiders would eventually remember who they were supposed to be and reclaim their place among the NFL's elite. But in 2010, with another losing season complete, with Jamarcus Russell's failure complete, with the coaching carousel still spinning, with Al Davis aging and the franchise seemingly without direction, that hope was being severely tested. The Raiders had descended into darkness, and the path back to the light remained unclear, uncertain, requiring changes that hadn't yet been made and decisions that hadn't yet been contemplated. On October 8, 2011, Al Davis died at the age of 82. The man who had taken over a 1-13 team in 1963 and transformed it into a dynasty, who had coined commitment to excellence, who had fought the NFL and moved franchises and won 3 Super Bowls, who had been the Raiders in every meaningful sense for 48 years, was gone. His passing marked the end of an era, not just for the Raiders, but for professional football itself. There would never be another owner-executive quite like Al Davis. Never another figure who exerted such complete control over a franchise for nearly half a century, who was so intertwined with a team's identity that separating the man from the organization was impossible. Davis's final years had been difficult, marked by the franchise's decline, by decisions that hadn't worked, by watching the excellence he had built slip away despite his efforts to restore it. But his legacy was secure. 3 Super Bowl championships, a spot in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, a coaching tree that included some of the most successful coaches in NFL history, a franchise identity, the silver and black, the outlaw mystique, the commitment to excellence, that would endure long after his death. Al Davis had been many things: visionary, rebel, genius, stubborn, controversial, dedicated. But above all, he had been a winner, and his impact on professional football was immeasurable. The franchise Davis left behind was fractured, struggling, still mired in the same dysfunction that had plagued it for nearly a decade. Mark Davis, Al's son, inherited ownership of the Raiders. Mark had worked for the franchise in various capacities for years, but he had never wielded the kind of control his father had never been groomed as an obvious successor the way children of some sports owners are. The transition was difficult, the franchise rudderless at first, trying to find its identity without the man who had been its driving force for so long. The Raiders continued to struggle through the early 2010s. More coaching changes, more disappointing seasons, more draft picks that didn't pan out. But slowly, gradually, Mark Davis began to make his own mark on the franchise. He was different from his father, less confrontational, more willing to delegate authority, more open to modern approaches to team building. The results didn't come immediately, but there were signs of stabilization, of a franchise trying to find solid ground after years of chaos. In 2018, Mark Davis made a decision that shocked the football world. He hired John Gruden to return as head coach of the Raiders. Gruden, who had left the Raiders 16 years earlier in that bitter trade to Tampa Bay, who had then defeated Oakland in Super Bowl 37 in the most painful way imaginable, was coming back. The contract was massive, 10 years, $100 million, a commitment that signaled Davis believed Gruden was the answer, the man who could finally restore the Raiders to championship contention. The reunion was complicated, laden with history and emotion. Gruden had been beloved during his first stint with the Raiders, had helped transform Rich Gannon and the offense, had been part of that brief period of excellence in the early 2000s. But he had also been the enemy, the coach who had crushed Oakland's Super Bowl dreams. Now he was back, older, wealthier from his years as a television analyst, tasked with rebuilding the franchise he had once helped elevate. But an even bigger change was coming. one that would fundamentally alter the Raiders' identity once again. Mark Davis and the city of Oakland had been unable to reach an agreement on a new stadium. The Coliseum was aging, lacked modern amenities, couldn't generate the revenue that new stadiums in other cities were producing. Negotiations dragged on, frustration mounted, and eventually, Mark Davis made the decision that his father had made twice before. He would move the franchise. This time, the destination wasn't Los Angeles. It was Las Vegas, the gambling and entertainment capital of America, a city that had never had major professional sports teams because of concerns about gambling's influence on sports. But those concerns had eased. Las Vegas had built a world-class arena for hockey's Golden Knights, and the city was eager to add an NFL team to its portfolio of attractions. In 2020, the Oakland Raiders became the Las Vegas Raiders. The move was wrenching for Oakland, a second abandonment, a second time having the team ripped away. The city that had supported the Raiders through their earliest years, that had welcomed them back from Los Angeles, that had remained faithful even through the darkest losing seasons, was losing its team again, this time seemingly for good. The pain was real, the sense of betrayal profound. But in Las Vegas, a spectacular new home awaited. Allegiant Stadium, a gleaming $2 billion facility with a partially translucent roof, state-of-the-art everything, 65,000 seats, luxury boxes that would generate massive revenue. It was a palace, the kind of stadium Al Davis had always dreamed of but never achieved. The stadium sat just off the Las Vegas Strip, visible from the highway, a monument to excess and ambition that somehow fit perfectly with the Raiders' outlaw image. The Las Vegas Raiders. It sounded strange, almost surreal. The Raiders had been Oakland's team. Even during the Los Angeles years, the connection to Oakland remained in memory. But now they were Las Vegas, playing in a city of neon and casinos, a city built on entertainment and spectacle. Yet somehow it worked. Las Vegas embraced the silver and black. The city's showmanship and the Raiders' mystique seemed to complement each other. Allegiant Stadium became one of the NFL's premier venues, drawing visiting fans who made entire weekends out of Raiders games, combining football with all the entertainment Las Vegas offered. The move coincided with the COVID-19 pandemic, which meant the 2020 season was played in an empty stadium, without fans, without the atmosphere that Allegiant Stadium was designed to showcase. It was an eerie beginning, playing in this magnificent new facility with no one there to witness it. But even without crowds, the Raiders were competitive, were showing signs of improvement under Gruden's leadership. And then, in 2021, just as it seemed the Raiders might be turning a corner, scandal struck. Emails from years earlier surfaced, showing Gruden using racist, homophobic, and misogynistic language in private correspondence. The revelations were devastating, indefensible. Gruden, under immense pressure, resigned as head coach midway through the 2021 season. The massive 10-year contract was over after just 3.5 years. The grand reunion had ended in disgrace, and once again the Raiders were searching for direction. But something remarkable happened after Gruden's departure. The team, rather than collapsing under the weight of scandal and disruption, rallied. Interim head coach Rich Bisaccia took over, and the players, showing resilience and determination that recalled the Raiders' teams of old, kept winning. They fought through adversity, overcame obstacles, and incredibly, improbably, made the playoffs, a surprise playoff run that no one outside the organization believed was possible given the chaos they had endured. The playoff appearance was brief. They lost in the wild card round, but it represented something important. The Raiders had shown they could respond to adversity, could overcome dysfunction, could still find that commitment to excellence even when circumstances suggested giving up would be easier. It reignited hope, gave fans reason to believe that maybe, despite everything, the franchise was finally moving in the right direction. The decade from 2011 to 2021 had seen everything. The death of the franchise's defining figure, continued struggles and coaching changes, a stunning reunion with a former coach, relocation to a new city and a spectacular new stadium, scandal and resignation, and finally a surprise playoff run that suggested better days might actually be ahead. It was chaos and change, heartbreak and hope. The Raiders in transition, trying to find their identity in a new era without Al Davis, in a new city far from their Oakland roots, in a league that had evolved dramatically since the glory years. Mark Davis had inherited a fractured franchise, and his tenure had been marked by bold decisions. Bringing back Gruden, moving to Las Vegas, building Allegiant Stadium, not all of which had worked out as planned. But the stadium was undeniably magnificent. The Las Vegas market was embracing the team, and that 2021 playoff run suggested that perhaps, finally, the foundation was being laid for something sustainable, something that could return the Raiders to the kind of consistent competitiveness they hadn't experienced since the early 2000s. The silver and black now flew in Las Vegas, in a city of lights and spectacle, in a stadium that gleamed like a jewel in the desert. The journey from Oakland to Los Angeles and back to Oakland and now to Las Vegas had been long, complicated, often painful. But the Raiders endured, adapted, survived. The commitment to excellence that Al Davis had coined 60 years earlier remained the goal, even if achieving it had proven elusive for so long. And now, in this new city, in this new era, with a new generation of fans discovering what it meant to be Raiders fans, the franchise looked toward the future with cautious optimism, with hope tempered by experience, with the belief that somewhere ahead, the glory days might return. The years since that surprising playoff run in 2021 have continued the pattern that has defined the Raiders for much of the past 2 decades. Flashes of promise followed by collapse. Moments when it seems the franchise has finally found stability only to have it slip away again. The eternal cycle of hope and disappointment that tests even the most devoted fans' faith. New coaches have come, brought their systems and philosophies, promised to be the ones who finally unlock the potential everyone can see, but no one can quite harness. Some have shown promise, others have failed quickly, but none yet have delivered the sustained excellence that the franchise's history demands, that the commitment to excellence requires. New stars have emerged, young players who show the talent and determination to be great, who give fans reason to believe that this draft class, this group of players, will be the foundation of the next championship team. Defensive stars who make game-changing plays, offensive weapons who score touchdowns and move the chains, quarterbacks who show flashes of brilliance that recall the great Raiders signal callers of the past. Individual excellence still exists, still thrives, even amid organizational uncertainty, proof that the silver and black can still attract and develop talent. But the familiar turmoil persists. Coaching changes continue, front office decisions are questioned. The gap between expectation and reality remains frustratingly wide. The Raiders win enough to keep hope alive, but lose enough to prevent satisfaction. Hover in that middle ground where they're neither terrible enough to completely rebuild nor good enough to compete for championships. It's a purgatory of mediocrity punctuated by occasional excellence, a frustrating existence for a franchise whose history includes 3 Super Bowl championships and some of the greatest teams ever to play the game. Allegiant Stadium remains magnificent, a state-of-the-art facility that ranks among the NFL's finest venues. On game days, it fills with fans in silver and black, the modern version of the black hole creating noise and passion, making Las Vegas one of the league's more intimidating environments when the team gives them something to cheer about. Visiting fans make pilgrimages to Las Vegas, combining football with entertainment, and the Raiders have found a home market that embraces them, that appreciates the spectacle and the history, that has adopted this franchise that has already belonged to 2 other cities. The relationship with Oakland remains complicated, painful. There are still fans in the Bay Area who consider themselves Raiders fans, who grew up watching the team at the Coliseum, who remember the championships and the great players and refuse to let geography end their devotion. But there are also those who feel betrayed twice, who gave up on the Raiders when the team left again, who won't forgive a franchise that abandoned them not once but twice. The wounds haven't healed, may never fully heal. And yet, through every city and every era, through Oakland and Los Angeles and back to Oakland and now Las Vegas, through the glory years and the dark years and everything in between, the Raiders remain unmistakably themselves. They are still the NFL's ultimate outlaw franchise, still the team that embraces rebels and misfits, still the organization that does things differently, that refuses to conform to conventional wisdom, that carries an identity forged in the 1960s and maintained through every subsequent decade. The silver and black still means something. It represents toughness, rebellion, a refusal to accept limitations. It recalls the great teams of the past, the 1976 Super Bowl champions with their 8 Hall of Famers, the 1980 Wild Card team that shocked everyone, the 1983 juggernaut that crushed Washington in the Super Bowl. It brings to mind legendary players, Ken Stabler's coolness, Marcus Allen's brilliance, Charles Woodson's intelligence and intensity, and dozens of others who wore the uniform with pride and excellence. The commitment to excellence that Al Davis coined remains the franchise's motto, even though achieving that excellence has proven elusive in recent decades. It's a standard to aspire to, a reminder of what the Raiders are supposed to be, a measuring stick against which every season, every decision, every performance is evaluated. The current teams fall short of that standard more often than not, but the standard persists, unchanging, demanding a connection to the franchise's greatest era. The outlaw mystique endures too. The Raiders are still the team other fan bases love to hate, still seen as villains even when they're not winning enough to truly threaten anyone. The image of the pirate logo, the skull and crossbones on some fans' gear, the leather and spikes and chains in the stands, all of it maintains an identity that transcends one-loss records, that exists independent of current success, that makes the Raiders distinctive in a league where many franchises blend together. Future seasons will bring more change, inevitably. New coaches will be hired when current ones fail. New players will be drafted and signed, given opportunities to become the next great Raiders, to add their names to the franchise's storied history. Seasons will be played in that magnificent Las Vegas stadium. Wins and losses will accumulate. Playoffs will be reached or missed, and the cycle will continue. Hope in training camp, reality during the season, evaluation in the off-season, and then hope again when the next year begins. Perhaps one of these seasons will be different. Perhaps the right combination of coach and quarterback and roster will finally come together, will finally produce not just a playoff appearance, but a sustained run of excellence, a return to the championship contention that has been absent for so long. Perhaps the Raiders will win another Super Bowl, will add a 4th Lombardi trophy to the case, will prove that the commitment to excellence is more than just words, that the silver and black can still mean dominance and not just history. Or perhaps the struggles will continue, the mediocrity will persist, and the Raiders will remain trapped in that middle ground for years to come, always promising but never quite delivering, always on the verge but never quite breaking through. The future is uncertain, unknowable, dependent on decisions not yet made and players not yet drafted and circumstances that can't be predicted. But whatever that future holds, the Raiders will face it as they have faced everything else, as outlaws, as rebels, as the franchise that refuses to be ordinary even when ordinary might be easier. They will wear silver and black, will play in that gleaming stadium in the desert, will carry forward the legacy of Al Davis and John Madden and all the great players who came before. They will be, as they have always been and always will be, the Raiders. And their fans, those devoted supporters who have stuck with the team through championships and collapses, through 3 different cities and countless coaching changes, through glory and heartbreak, and everything in between, will continue to believe. Because that's what being a Raiders fan means. Believing in the silver and black even when evidence suggests belief is foolish. Holding on to the commitment to excellence even when excellence seems impossible. Maintaining faith that the next season, the next coach, the next draft will finally be the one that returns the franchise to glory. The Raiders' story continues, being written day by day, season by season, in a new city but with the same identity, with new challenges but the same goals, with an uncertain future but a glorious past. From those chaotic beginnings in 1960, through the championships and the heartbreaks, through Al Davis's vision and the moves between cities, through the greatest players and the worst draft busts, the thread remains unbroken. The Oakland Raiders, the Los Angeles Raiders, the Las Vegas Raiders, different names, same team. Still silver and black. Still committed to excellence, even when achieving it proves elusive. Still the NFL's outlaws, rebels, the franchise that will never be like everyone else.